Welcome back again. As usual, please comment down below what time it is, wherever you are right now, and press the like button. Let's get to it. In August of 1989, an entire family of 4 vanished into the night without a trace. No goodbye notes, no evidence of where they went, just silence. What could convince 2 parents to leave home in the middle of the night with their children, climbing into a stranger's pickup truck? And why, more than 3 decades later, has not a single confirmed clue surfaced about where they went? This is the story of the Jack family, and what began as hope for a new start turned into one of Canada's most haunting mysteries. Why would a family risk everything by trusting a stranger? For the Jacks, the answer is hidden in years of hardship, layers of wounds from the past, and the crushing weight of daily survival. At first glance, the choice to climb into an unknown man's truck with 2 young children seems unthinkable. But when placed within the context of their lives, the moment begins to make a tragic kind of sense. Ronald Jack grew up in British Columbia and worked hard through his early years. By the time he reached his late 20s, he was a husband and a father to 2 boys, Russell and Ryan. He was a logger, a profession many men in northern communities relied on. Logging provided steady pay, and for men like Ronald, it was also an identity. But his career ended after an injury to his back. At first, it was just pain. Then it meant lost workdays. Soon it became permanent unemployment. Jobs, suited for a man with physical limitations in that region, didn't appear often. Job boards were sparse, and companies could be selective. For Ronald, each month stretched thinner than the last. His wife, Doreen, carried her own burdens. She was a survivor of Canada's residential school system. That meant she had spent much of her childhood removed from family, language, and tradition. In those schools, Indigenous children endured strict rules, discipline, and too often, physical or sexual abuse. Doreen had lived through those experiences, and like many survivors, the memories carried forward into adulthood. Pain from the past does not vanish when someone leaves the building where it happened. It lingers, shaping how a person trusts, copes, and raises their children. Together, Ronald and Doreen navigated these difficulties while raising Russell, age 9, and Ryan, age 4. On paper, they were just another family in Prince George, a city in central British Columbia that acted as a hub for timber and industry. But inside their household, life was far from stable. Ronald's injury kept him from consistent work. Doreen's responsibilities at home left little opportunity for outside employment. Their family survived on welfare payments. At a time when social assistance carried stigma, this dependence only added to the stress. What happens when financial pressure piles on top of personal trauma? For the Jacks, the result was a family trying to stay afloat in a system that left few chances to recover. Arguments about money filtered into household life. Unexpected bills caused panic. The tasks of parenting young children layered on top. Every parent knows the demands of school clothes, packed lunches, and children's medical appointments. Without steady income, those things become battles. Ronald's frustration grew with each passing month. Not being able to support his family the way he once had weighed heavily. Friends and relatives later remembered how much he longed for a job. Even when opportunities sounded thin, he wanted to believe in them. The idea of steady pay, meals for the children, and perhaps even the pride of returning home with money in his pocket was powerful. Desperation can reshape judgment. When the only alternative seems to be sinking deeper into poverty, people sometimes hold on to fragile hopes. Meanwhile, Doreen carried the invisible stress of living with her trauma. The past was never far away, and when combined with the harsh realities of present day, it created a family environment steeped in pressure. For their children, Russell and Ryan, life was coloured by this constant tension. They were loved, but they were part of a household running on the fumes of survival. Trust is complicated in such situations. On one hand, years of hardship can make people wary. On the other, when a possible solution appears, even in the most unlikely form, the hope for change can override caution. For Ronald and Doreen, a stranger with a proposal was not simply another man in town. He represented freedom from endless waiting, from the constant calculations of which bill to pay first, or how to stretch groceries through the week. It is important to understand that this was not just about finances. Emotional exhaustion compounds financial stress. When someone feels cornered, with no practical path forward, risky decisions begin to look reasonable. Ronald and Doreen were not careless parents making reckless choices. They were individuals weighed down by a cycle of unemployment, systemic barriers, and the exhaustion of trying to break free. By the summer of 1989, they were searching for hope in any form it arrived. Imagine the moment. A man offers Ronald an opportunity. The description plays directly into their needs: good pay, housing, the ability to bring both children along, even daycare provided at the site. It sounded designed to ease every single obstacle standing in their way. For Ronald, unable to secure steady work for months, the words must have been intoxicating. For Doreen, the chance to leave behind the grind of Prince George and step into something supportive may have been the relief she longed for. Viewed with hindsight, it is tempting to say they should have been suspicious. But survival looks different when you are caught inside it. Offers that appear suspicious to outsiders can sound like miracles to those living without options. This was not simply a new job. It was a full solution. Shelter, childcare, income, everything missing from their daily lives, tied together in one promise. And so, when the offer arrived in that Prince George pub, it was not taken lightly. It was weighed against years of disappointment, against the strain of unemployment and the echo of Doreen's childhood experiences. It was compared against the ache of Ronald's injury and the endless welfare paperwork. If they turned it down, what waited for them? More months of the same frustrations. Viewed through that lens, trusting a stranger seemed like less of a gamble and more of a necessity. The Jack family were not prepared for what was to come. To them, the stranger seemed like a lifeline. In reality, it was the beginning of an ordeal that left them missing from history. That night, Ronald and Doreen's calculated hope allowed them to accept an offer. And in their minds, the decision was not reckless at all. It was the only path forward. But who exactly offered them this lifeline? How could one brief encounter seal a family's fate? On the night of August 1st, 1989, Ronald Jack spent his evening at the First Litra pub in Prince George, a place where many locals gathered after long days. That night may have started like many others, but it quickly shifted into something that would change his family's future forever. At some point during the evening, Ronald met a man no one would later be able to identify. Witnesses remembered the stranger as tall, heavy-set, with reddish-brown hair and a full beard. He carried himself with confidence, but he was not familiar around town. People came and went through Prince George, especially in jobs tied to logging or mining, so an unfamiliar face was not unusual. But this man had more than conversation to offer. He claimed he could change Ronald's situation with a new job, good wages, and stability that had been out of reach for months. The stranger described work at a camp near Cluckel's Lake. It was set up like the type of project common in British Columbia in the late 1980s. Logging camps, small-scale construction jobs, and contracts in remote settings often pulled men away from home for weeks at a time. Men would work long shifts, live in camp housing, and earn enough to keep their families going between jobs. For Ronald, whose back injury limited job options, the appeal was clear. This was presented as camp work that did not simply employ him. It supported his entire family. According to the man, housing would be available, meals covered, and, most unusually, daycare for the children. That detail set this proposal apart. Daycare facilities were not a standard benefit in remote camps. A promise like that would have been rare. For the Jacks, it touched directly on their needs. Ronald and Doreen often had to juggle childcare while managing their financial struggles. A safe option for Russell and Ryan while they stayed near their father's worksite must have sounded like a relief. This meant Ronald could work without worrying about leaving his family behind or searching for babysitting arrangements. It looked like every obstacle had been anticipated and solved inside this single offer. Still, some people might have questioned the deal. A stranger at a bar with promises that sounded almost too precise. A new camp, unknown to locals. The timing of the meeting. Every element had marks of risk attached. Yet when someone has been searching unsuccessfully for work for months, doubts can be replaced by the hope that maybe, finally, luck has shifted. Ronald might have noticed the unusual details, but what weighed heavier for him was the possibility of shaking loose from the routine of poverty and hopelessness. There is also the setting to consider. A bar is often a place where men share stories, trade information, and make connections. In small or mid-sized towns, work opportunities sometimes traveled this way, from word of mouth rather than formal postings. If someone claimed to know a foreman looking to hire, it did not always sound strange. For Ronald, the location reinforced possibility rather than suspicion. Witnesses confirmed that the man and Ronald spent time together at the pub that evening. The conversation lasted long enough to provide detailed terms. The pay was said to be higher than other local opportunities. The camp provided housing close to the job site. The possibility for Doreen to stay with him made it appear like a family-centered arrangement. Ronald did not dismiss it. He listened, then agreed. By all accounts, there was no sign of hesitancy by the end of the conversation. The psychology of the moment is important. Desperation can widen trust. When almost every door seems closed, the one that opens, even slightly, often appears brighter than it really is. The Jacks had lived on welfare, faced injuries, and endured barriers common for indigenous families in British Columbia at the time. Under those circumstances, the risk of trusting a stranger may not have felt like much of a risk at all. It may have felt like the only rational choice left. The man gave enough detail to make the offer sound plausible, but not so much that others could later confirm it. Whether by design or coincidence, he set terms in vague but attractive language. Cluckul's Lake, a known location outside Prince George, added credibility. Most people had heard of camps in such areas, but nothing about the specific site could be verified afterward. Ronald accepted. He did not go home to debate the choice for weeks. He did not search for second opinions. According to those close to the family, Ronald made the decision that very night. He told the man he and his family would join him. The stranger had a pickup truck ready. They would leave that evening, heading toward the supposed job site. This quick transition from offer to acceptance shows how powerful the promise had been. For Ronald, time was not a luxury. The family's situation required change now, not in months. The security of work outweighed suspicion. Within a matter of hours, the family's course was set. Looking back today, everything about the moment becomes more haunting. The physical description of the man, though detailed, has never led to a confirmed suspect. His large build, reddish-brown hair, and beard are the only clear identifiers known. The offer of camp work, though attractive, left no paperwork or employment records to follow. Every aspect of that short conversation acted as a launch point for something terrible, yet left behind almost nothing concrete to investigate. How did a chance encounter in a pub transform into the erasure of an entire family? That is the chilling part of this story. One evening, one meeting, one agreement. The stranger offered stability, but instead, he became associated with disappearance. By closing time, Ronald had accepted. The Jacks prepared to travel with him before dawn, eager to step into what they believed was a brighter chapter. Instead, it would be the last decision recorded before 4 people vanished from their community without explanation. Now that the deal was struck, what unfolded in the hours that followed would be even more troubling. What happened in those final hours before they climbed into the truck? Late on the night of August 1st, 1989, inside the modest Jack household, the family began gathering their belongings. Clothes were pulled together, small items were packed, and the movement carried an air of both excitement and urgency. It was not the gradual collection of possessions seen before a vacation. This was quick, deliberate, and late enough that neighbours might not have even noticed. The suddenness suggested the offer Ronald had accepted earlier in the evening was not a distant plan but something already in motion. Ronald demonstrated that this job opportunity was not just talk when he picked up the phone and called his brother. In the quiet hours of the night, he asked if childcare could be arranged. To some, this might seem unusual given the supposed arrangement was that daycare would be available at the camp, but Ronald's call indicated he was serious enough about the plan to prepare a backup. It also showed that he had internalized the offer and begun fitting it into the family's real needs, a step that moves any idea from possibility into reality. Calls like this reinforced that Ronald had not simply told Doreen about the stranger's pitch. He was taking active steps to line up a new beginning. Another phone call added a strange layer to the night. Sometime before leaving, Ronald reached out to his mother. The words he used were vague, almost puzzling. It was the kind of call that revealed little detail, but conveyed that some change was coming. For his mother, who was used to his struggles, the late-night timing and cryptic tone may have been unsettling. With hindsight, the call took on the weight of a farewell, though at the time it may have sounded more like an update without clarity. Those words became one of the last direct traces of Ronald's voice. Meanwhile, inside the home, both parents prepared Russell, 9 years old, and Ryan, only 4. Packing for children often includes small but important essentials: favorite clothing, items for comfort, perhaps school materials, if they expected to be away for long. Witnesses later recalled that the family appeared eager, as if heading to something promising, rather than weighed down in dread. The children were dressed, belongings sorted, and the atmosphere was hurried but not panicked. That distinction mattered to relatives who saw them. This was not a family fleeing an emergency. This was a family setting out with purpose, convinced the offer to relocate was safe. The quick pace of their actions showed a trust in the opportunity that had been placed before them. No one tried to stop them. Those around the Jacks viewed the decision as a chance at stability, one that could help both parents recover financially and allow the children to have more secure lives. In families where every dollar counted, new work possibilities often inspired encouragement rather than warnings. Those watching the departure may have worried, but they also understood why Ronald and Doreen would take the risk. The unusual part was the timing. Families do not often set out for a new life in the middle of the night, but when a ride is offered and conditions are set by someone else, there is less room for negotiation. The stranger from the pub was the driver. He controlled not only the introduction to the new job, but also the travel timetable. If he insisted they leave after dark, the Jacks would have to agree. And they did. Whether because of urgency on his part or simple coincidence, it meant the Jacks' final hours in their community were marked by quick packing, brief phone calls, and late-night activity. The pickup truck arrived. Witnesses described the vehicle, but decades later, those details were never enough to conclusively identify it. Ronald loaded his family into the stranger's vehicle. This moment, the crossing of the threshold from home into an unfamiliar truck, cemented the point at which the Jacks became vulnerable beyond measure. Once the doors closed, their control was limited. They were no longer in their house where relatives might check on them. They were not in a public space like the pub, where others might watch. They were isolated inside a vehicle, in transit toward an unknown site. It is chilling, in hindsight, to note how ordinary the departure seemed. Families leave town for work sites all the time. In central British Columbia, it is part of the rhythm of life. One week a father is home, the next he is at a camp. Mothers, children, and pickup trucks moving between towns was familiar. Nothing outwardly signaled danger. That may be why none of those who witnessed the departure insisted they stay behind. To them, this was not the last time they would see the Jacks alive. It was just another goodbye, but this was the last time. Every detail afterward faded to silence. No further phone calls, no letters or paychecks from a camp, no return visits to Prince George. The stranger and the family that climbed into his truck left together, and by morning, they were gone. All future searches would trace their absence back to this single moment, this late-night ride out of the city. The urgency of the packing, the cryptic call to Ronald's mother, and the trust placed into an arrangement that seemed slightly too perfect now sit as red flags. At the time, they were pieces of a puzzle that seemed to finally come together for the Jacks. To their relatives, it was cause for cautious hope. To a community familiar with economic struggle, it was understandable. But to history, it became the final act of a family before their lives vanished into mystery. Every missing person case has a point where the trail drops off. For the Jacks, it was the moment their home fell silent and the truck drove them away. All past difficulty and all future uncertainty intersected in those final hours. It was the last time their presence was verifiable, the final hours before speculation would begin. Their departure sealed their disappearance in one undeniable way. The family, once visible and present in their lives, had entered a chapter that no one around them could follow. The pickup truck symbolized transition, but instead of work and security, it carried the Jacks into disappearance. But the aftermath would make the mystery even stranger. How could a family vanish within hours of leaving their home? The night of August 1st, 1989, provided the setting for the Jacks' final known movements. They had packed their belongings, spoken of new work, and stepped into a stranger's vehicle. From that moment, details dissolve into silence. Their departure marked the shift from hope to mystery, as one decision carried them beyond the reach of everyone who knew them. The vehicle waiting outside their home was said to be a pickup truck. The driver was described as large, heavy-set, with reddish-brown hair and a beard. His offer of opportunities at a camp near Clukil's Lake had been convincing enough to lead Ronald, Doreen, and their two sons to join him almost immediately. The family had no car of their own. That detail is important because it meant they had no control over their transportation. The man at the wheel decided the route, the timing, and the destination. The Jacks were not able to follow in their own vehicle, nor could they leave halfway through the journey. Their reliance on the stranger placed every outcome in his hands. The roads, stretching out from Prince George toward Clukil's Lake, were familiar to many at the time. They wound through forests and smaller communities, the kind of highways where weary drivers often passed with little notice of who else shared the road. But when analysing the Jacks' disappearance, those roads also became the stage for speculation. Could anyone have seen the pickup that night? Did someone pass a vehicle carrying a family without realising its significance? If so, those fleeting glances were never transformed into leads. No recorded sightings made it into case files. No travellers remembered the vehicle, and no community along the way reported the sudden arrival of Ronald and Doreen at a campsite. That lack of contact became noticeable very quickly. Friends and family, who had been told the Jacks were leaving, assumed they would check in. A call after arrival, a letter describing the camp, or news of pay from Ronald's first days of work. But those updates never came. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Messages might trail off, or communication shifts become apparent over weeks. For the Jacks, silence began instantly. By the morning after their departure, no calls or visits arrived. Perfect, quiet, settled. A silence so abrupt that it marked the night as an ending. The supposed camp job has stood at the center of the puzzle ever since. Ronald had described it to those he spoke with that evening. He mentioned Clukil's Lake, the pay, the benefits, and the daycare placement for his children. Yet no camp fitting that description was ever identified in records or through later interviews. Investigators searched for such a location, but discovered no evidence it existed. Was the camp fabricated? Was the story simply bait designed to reassure Ronald and Doreen? These questions have followed the case as theories emerged. Advocates and investigators remain split between believing the camp was a real but untraceable operation, or that the stranger's words were fiction. Rural British Columbia contained many camps in that period. Jobs were sometimes recorded informally, shifts arranged by connections rather than paperwork. It is possible that Ronald assumed inconsistency in records was normal. For an unemployed man seeking employment, the promise of any site might have seemed enough, but the missing paperwork and lack of witnesses from that supposed camp raised red flags after the family vanished. People living near Clukil's Lake did not recall a camp hiring parents with young children. Opportunities in those areas often demanded long hours in difficult conditions without accommodation for families. That contradiction strengthens the idea that the camp could have been entirely fictitious. Consider how unusual the offer actually was. Employment camps rarely invited families to live on site. They were structured for workers only, to keep costs low and focus on productivity. The daycare feature stood apart from industry norms, almost designed to win over Ronald and Doreen by resolving their specific concerns. If it was a fabricated detail, it served its purpose well. This absence of confirmation sits alongside the eerie gap left in their community. No one reported seeing Ronald, Doreen, or the boys at local stores after that night. Hospitals and service accounts did not record them. Welfare offices received no follow-ups. Schools did not see Russell return for the fall term. It was as if the family's lives had been erased the moment the pickup pulled away. Families often leave towns for work, but there are usually phone calls, notes, or sightings. In this case, there was complete erasure. The long roads extending from Prince George to the surrounding countryside became the backdrop for theories. Those highways ran through isolated terrain. At night, traffic thinned out until stretches could be travelled without passing another car for miles. For anyone driving after dark, options opened for small stops or detours unnoticed by others. Did the man in the pickup take the Jacks to a real camp but never follow through with the promised arrangements? Or did he never intend to go near Clukil's Lake at all? Once on those roads, his choices were obscured by geography and timing. Looking back at the timeline, the moment of disappearance comes down to hours. They left at night. By sunrise in northern British Columbia, families are usually awake, children readying for summer routines, parents preparing for the day. But for the Jacks, morning arrived without their presence. Their house was empty. Their relatives were waiting but heard nothing. An entire family had crossed into absence in less than half a day. It is chilling to think of how fast it happened. Neighbours may have still been asleep when the truck drove away. Relatives awoke, thinking the Jacks were on their way toward a new opportunity, not realising they had already faded from contact. That contrast makes the timing feel sharper. 1 hour they were a struggling but present family in Prince George. The next morning, they existed only as questions. By the time concern grew, the trail was already cold. No records verified Ronald's employment. No camp employer in the Clukil's Lake region stepped forward. No receipts, no confirmed truck descriptions beyond what witnesses provided, and no contact from the family themselves. It left investigators with an empty gap stretching from the pickup outside their home into the endless landscape surrounding Prince George. The disappearance of an individual often sparks quick questions, but the disappearance of 4, parents and young children at once, stands apart in scale and mystery. This larger vanishing sat heavily on their community. Families expected to hear noises of children playing, updates from Ronald and Doreen, yet all of it was cut short. By morning, they were gone without a trace. That silence has carried forward through decades, shaping one of Canada's most enduring mysteries. Authorities soon entered the picture, but made mistakes that would haunt the investigation. Did the first police mistakes cost the family's only chance of being found? The disappearance of the Jack family was reported within days of their quiet departure. At that point, it still seemed possible that they were safe somewhere, waiting for contact or preparing to send word back. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police began their investigation in early August 1989, but what unfolded next confused the public and created mistrust that has lasted decades. Only days into the search, authorities made an astonishing error. They publicly announced that Ronald, Doreen, and the children had been located. The news spread quickly. The family was safe, the case closed, and there was no reason for community alarm. But it was not true. The announcement proved false, and investigators had to retract their statement. By then, the damage was already done. With their disappearance falsely resolved, attention faded at a critical time. The first days in any missing persons case matter most. Leads are fresh, memories are sharper, and sightings can be more easily confirmed. By closing the case prematurely, investigators allowed that early energy to disappear. The retraction caused confusion among the public and created delays in gathering information. Some who might have stepped forward with accounts of the family's last hours assumed the matter had been settled. Others doubted later appeals for help, unsure whether the RCMP were committed to pursuing the matter seriously. For Indigenous families in particular, who were already well aware of unequal treatment from authorities, this error looked like something far more serious than a mistake. It looked like a sign that their community members did not receive the same urgency as others. The premature closure also meant that valuable hours passed without full investigative effort. Family and neighbours could have been approached more quickly. Witnesses at the pub might have recalled sharper details just days after the meeting with the stranger. Routes toward Cluquil's Lake might have offered traces if searched at once. Instead, the investigation restarted from a weakened position, with time already lost. The police tried to recover momentum, but it was much harder now to regain the community trust that had vanished with the false announcement. The investigation leaned on media support to spread awareness. Crime Stoppers produced reenactments of the Jack family's last days, broadcasting segments on television to reach new audiences. These dramatizations were a tool often used in that period, meant to jog memory and encourage the public to call with tips. Viewers saw versions of Ronald meeting the stranger in the pub, the family preparing for a hopeful departure, and then leaving in the pickup truck. For families of the missing, these reenactments were both painful and useful. They placed the loved ones back into the public eye and made the story harder to forget. But even this media push contained serious limitations. The broadcasts did not reach into the very region where the camp had supposedly been located. Cluquil's Lake, the target destination named by the man in the pub, sat outside the broadcast area. That meant people living near the area most connected to the story may never have seen the reenactments. Locals who might have driven those roads or lived near possible sites went unexposed to the reconstructions. The mismatch reduced the already narrow chances of catching new leads. At the community level, fear and frustration grew. Families in Prince George, particularly Indigenous families, watched as days turned into weeks without clear progress. The Jack family had not returned. No contact came from Ronnie or Doreen. Even their welfare payments stopped without use. Yet the police response appeared to lack urgency. In other cases across Canada, white families often saw immediate, intensive campaigns. Helicopters, roadblocks, and widespread media calls for action appeared quickly. Here, locals noticed the pace was different. The weight of unresolved residential school trauma and ongoing societal prejudice influenced how Indigenous families viewed this delay. It was not simply a bureaucratic issue. It was another reminder of injustice. Parents across the community felt the unease. If an entire family could vanish without trace, who was safe? But while families whispered about danger and possible foul play, the official posture lagged behind. The delay allowed skepticism to creep deep into the case. People wondered if police believed the Jacks might have simply chosen to move on. Questions circulated about whether the disappearance was treated like abandonment rather than abduction. Authorities offered limited public reassurances, further fueling the distrust. By the end of the first year, no suspects were in custody, no sites excavated, and no strong evidence recovered. Witness statements provided a general description of the man at the bar, but no name was ever attached. Without momentum, the case drifted. Fear hardened into cynicism, especially within Indigenous circles. They saw the Jack story lined up beside many other missing and murdered Indigenous cases, trapped in cycles of slow responses and limited accountability. The emotional distance between the community and investigators became another obstacle. Families and friends of the Jacks wanted answers, but trust in the RCMP had eroded. Some chose not to share information or dismissed new appeals. Others continued pressing the case in local discussions, unwilling to let it disappear from memory even as official action slowed. For those most connected, the limits of law enforcement added to the wider grief. It was not only that their loved ones were missing, it was that the people tasked with protecting them seemed unwilling or unable to give their situation equal standing. The investigation tried to adapt by using available tools, flyers, public bulletins, and calls for tips repeated over the years. But with the earliest days lost to confusion, momentum waned each time. By the mid-1990s, the Jax's case was cold. The crime scene, if one existed, had never been documented. The man from the pub remained only a sketch. The pickup truck, a common vehicle in northern towns, was never identified. Almost nothing tangible remained except the deep wound of the family's absence. Yet the community never completely stopped watching. Newspaper articles and small reports appeared occasionally to remind the public of the story. Families continued to press for acknowledgement. Activists pointed to the case as an example of how Indigenous people were failed by systemic indifference. They argued that if mistakes in the first days had not occurred, or if urgency had matched the scale of the disappearance, perhaps the Jax disappearance would not have become another cold file. Distrust in the RCMP's commitment to finding answers grew as years passed. The early blunders were never forgotten. Many held the belief that those initial errors may have permanently sealed off opportunities for discovery. Each time a lead was missed, every year without progress, reinforced the sense of neglect. The investigation had begun too late, too weak, and never recovered. But years later, an anonymous call would carry chilling claims. Could one cryptic call have solved everything? For years, the disappearance of the Jack family had produced more questions than answers. Leads had gone quiet, tips had fizzled out, and no trace of Ronald, Doreen, Russell, or Ryan was discovered. Then, nearly 7 years after they vanished, something unexpected broke the silence. On January 28, 1996, an anonymous voice reached the RCMP late in the evening with information startling enough to reignite hope. The caller claimed to know where the Jack family could be found. The words, simple and direct, suggested the four had been killed and buried at the south end of a ranch. Seconds later, the line went dead. That was all. No names, no directions, no follow-up. For the investigators who answered the call, those few words carried immense weight. The Jack family's disappearance was by then a painful case that hung heavy over the Prince George area. The possibility that someone might have information specific enough to give a burial site sent shockwaves through the investigative team. But because the caller hung up before clarifying which ranch, where it was located, or how they knew the information, the tip was both charged with promise and almost impossible to act upon. The RCMP attempted to trace the call. Phone records tied it back to a residence in Vanderhoof, a small community west of where the Jacks had lived. But that address did not belong to anyone connected directly to the family or their disappearance. When investigators followed up, they discovered the call had been placed during a house party. Those inside claimed they had no idea who really made the call. Whether it was a guest in attendance, someone borrowing the phone, or even a person using the home without permission, no clear answer emerged. The lead, that had sounded like a breakthrough, dissolved into another dead end, clouded by noise, excuses, and uncertainty. The question then became simple but impossible to ignore. Was the anonymous tip legitimate, or was it just another cruel distraction? Investigators had to weigh the content carefully. The fact that the caller used the phrase, "the south end of a ranch," suggested specificity. It was not vague in the way that many hoaxes are. It did not say out in the woods or buried somewhere near Prince George. It pointed to a ranch, a geographic marker, and a directional cue. That sort of detail looked like insider knowledge to some, but because the caller provided nothing beyond that short phrase, no one knew whether it was an honest glimpse into the truth or a rehearsed piece of misinformation. As weeks passed with no further calls and no one stepping forward, authorities made the decision to release the audio of the tip to the public. By airing the recording, they hoped someone might recognize the voice, the tone, or even the way the words were phrased. It was not common for police to give out the sound of a call like this. Doing so indicated both their desperation and their belief that the caller was real enough to warrant recognition. The release attracted attention from locals across British Columbia, and people speculated endlessly about whose voice was on the tape. Yet public distribution still did not reveal the identity of the caller. The use of the word ranch also became a decades-long point of tension. Residents combed through their knowledge of the region. Which ranch could have matched the description? Vanderhoof had nearby farmland, as did communities along Highway 16, The southern portions of some ranches extended into remote and wooded terrain. Searching these areas without direct coordinates was nearly impossible. To this day, many believe that the phrase, "south end of a ranch," remains one of the most haunting details in the entire disappearance. It carried enough precision to light curiosity, but not enough to be useful in practice. The speculation deepened when considering motives. If the caller knew the truth, why would they end the call before giving specifics? Fear is one possibility. Perhaps the person worried that giving full details might expose them to retaliation. If they had first-hand involvement, the need to remain hidden would have been even stronger. Another theory suggested it was not someone directly linked to the crime, but an individual who had overheard details at a party or in a conversation years earlier. In that case, their nervousness could have caused them to abandon the call out of panic. There was also a darker explanation, that the entire call was a hoax meant only to toy with investigators and the family suffering in absence. Each possibility has remained unresolved. 7 years had passed since the Jacks were last seen when the call came. In that vast stretch of time, their file had become one of many open cases, but nothing else across those years had carried the potential weight of this anonymous voice. Every word was analysed. Every possible ranch was speculated. Families in the region whispered about whether the caller had been sitting on vital information all along. Others believed the scarceness of details proved it was a lie. Without further communication, no one could confirm. The RCMP considered the tip important enough to keep it alive. It remained in their case notes and was cited each time the disappearance resurfaced in headlines or community discussions. The law enforcement argument leaned on the possibility that revealing the caller could, in one stroke, explain everything. Identifying the person who used that phone in Vanderhoof might either validate the story of the ranch or disprove it as a fabrication. The importance of that moment has not lessened even decades after the call was placed. Even now, residents discuss the ranch tip in almost mythical terms. It became the kind of rumor that circulates in small towns for years. Community members still pass theories back and forth. A forgotten property, an unsearched pasture, or a lost clue hidden under soil that has since been ploughed over. Without evidence to confirm it, the sentence, "the south end of a ranch," continues to hang heavy, not as resolution, but as suggestion. The caller's words remain suspended between truth and fiction, their impact magnified because they never returned with clarification. Over time, the lack of discovery surrounding the tip has overshadowed the once electric hope it produced. Families connected to the Jacks grew frustrated each year. No action resulted. Activists and indigenous advocates pointed out how haunting it was that even when clear details emerged, systemic barriers seemed to halt effective follow-up. Was more pressure required to thoroughly investigate ranchlands at the time? Did law enforcement fully commit to chasing every acre down? The open questions festered into renewed criticism. To this day, the call remains the single most tantalizing but inconclusive lead connected to the Jack family. It embodies both what the case has and what it lacks. It offers specificity but not certainty. It dangles a possible site but never gives a path to find it. For investigators, the caller was like a shadow, slipping into a room, speaking just enough to draw attention before disappearing entirely. The voice captured on that recording still waits for recognition. The result is that an entire community continues to live with what-ifs. What if that call was the absolute truth? What if someone had stayed on the line long enough to lead police toward confirmation? What if, buried beneath acres of ranchland, the Jacks could have been recovered? Without answers, those questions continue to stretch across decades. The anonymity solidified the frustration, leaving the case twisting between closure and permanent uncertainty. The family's fate remained hidden. The tip burned brightly and then went out just as quickly, fading into 7 seconds of recorded words. 7 seconds that could have provided everything but ended with nothing. Despite this tip, the official search dragged on. Did investigators ever narrow down a real suspect? In the years after the Jack family disappeared, the central figure of interest remained the same: the unidentified man whom Ronald met at the pub. Witnesses gave police a clear physical description. He was said to be tall, heavy-set, with reddish-brown hair and a beard. His appearance stuck in people's memories, enough for officers to produce a sketch. Yet despite the detail, that sketch never led to a name. No one in Prince George, Vanderhoof, or the surrounding towns could confirm knowing a man who fit it exactly. The man seemed to appear one night, make his offer, and dissolve back into the crowds without leaving a trail. The lack of identity for this man created a constant challenge for investigators. Without a name, they could not cross-check employment records, property files, or even confirm whether he had ties to a camp at Klukel's Lake. The fact that he was described so clearly but never identified carries two difficult implications. Either he was truly unknown to the community, a traveler passing through, or he had deeper connections that were successfully hidden. Both directions left investigators circling the same dead ends, without clear progress forward. As the years went on, other names began to enter discussions, not through police confirmations, but through rumours in the community. British Columbia in the 1990s saw an increase in awareness about serial killers operating in Western Canada. When infamous figures like Robert Pickton were exposed, people began to connect them to any unsolved disappearance. Because the Jack family's case remained in the news, it became a target for speculation. Was the man at the pub connected to these broader crimes? Was their ending tied not to a personal promise gone wrong, but to larger patterns of predation and violence? Members of the Jack family urged people not to attach their disappearance to serial killer folklore. They emphasized that speculation did little to aid the real search for truth. The stranger who met Ronald had been described by witnesses and formed the core of the case. To pull focus away from him toward other notorious names risked burying the specific clues that might one day lead to discovery. Their reminder spoke to a larger tension in unsolved cases. It is easy for communities and even media to chase recognizable villains, but that focus can obscure local realities. Theories continued to multiply without evidence to support them. Some believed the offer of work at Clukil's Lake was genuine, but had collapsed into tragedy once the Jacks were there. Others believed the camp was a fabrication, invented to lure the family into isolation where no one could witness what followed. There was speculation about roadside violence, about opportunistic crime, and even about organized exploitation. Each theory had followers, but no one provided the concrete proof needed to elevate them above rumor. The police pursued many of these leads when they could. In the later years of the investigation, they interviewed people around Prince George and Vanderhoof who might have seen a man matching the description. They followed up tips that connected ranch properties, private landowners, and logged tracts of forest to the family. In some cases, they brought in radar equipment to search beneath soil for signs of graves. These efforts showed that authorities did not abandon the case entirely. However, radar sweeps and interviews produced nothing to tie back to Ronald, Doreen, or their sons. Searches ended, files closed, the land turned quiet again. The difficulty grew each time an effort ended without progress. Every property checked and cleared removed one possible resolution, but it also highlighted the sheer scope of the area still untouched. British Columbia's landscape is vast. Ranch properties stretch for miles. Logging areas rise and fall in remote hills where few outsiders travel. To suggest the family could be anywhere inside those hundreds of miles was to admit how slim the odds of recovery had become. The weight of uncertainty overshadowed official action. For every statement describing the mystery man at the pub, there were 3 rumors about other criminals. For every police sweep of land, there were 10 conversations in town about where else they might be. The abundance of theories created noise. With so many competing views, no single lead shone brighter than the rest. Investigators were left trying to listen through a wall of speculation, a task that often left them repeating the same steps, without new breakthroughs. Another challenge was time itself. Every year that passed allowed memories to weaken. Witnesses at the pub the night Ronald spoke to, the man could no longer recall details with the same clarity. A shirt colour remembered at the time blurred into uncertainty a decade later. A license plate that might have been written down in 1989 would not be recalled cleanly by 1999. The erosion of memory eroded evidence too. Even new property searches decades later faced the complication of disturbed soil, changed landmarks, or erased tracks. The longer the case lasted, the colder it became. Communities around the Highway 16 corridor, later labelled the Highway of Tears, recognised how typical this frustration had become. Families reported loved ones missing. Police responded with early actions, but without quick results, cases grew crowded by rumour. The Jack disappearance suffered the same cycle. By remaining unsolved, it became folded into wider conversations about serial violence, systemic failures, and community fear. Throughout the speculation, one consistent fact weighed against any broader theory. The entire chain of events led back to the man at the pub. He was the last confirmed contact. He provided the explanation for why the Jacks left home. He controlled their departure and was the final outsider to see them alive. Regardless of how many rumours developed over the years, no piece of speculation moved the case forward beyond him. The investigation circled again and again around this man, but with no name, no confirmed camp, and no recovery, it never broke through that limitation. For the Jack family's relatives, this central truth was infuriating. They did not have to speculate about predators far away or notorious names in the headlines. Their loved ones were last seen climbing into a stranger's pickup truck. All resolution started there and ended there. Theories outside that moment often distracted from the search for accountability. Yet because real evidence was lacking, those distractions gained ground, and the frustration grew. The Jack family's disappearance is remembered as an unsolved crime tied not to excessive detail, but to lack of it. Everything known points toward one man described in a pub, a drive toward Klukel's Lake, and silence. Beyond speculation, that is all investigators truly have. For decades, they attempted to knock down other rumors, attempted to search land and review files, but the circle always closed back to that single stranger. The tension between rumors, theories, and the void of evidence meant the case stayed trapped in uncertainty. Other names came and went across years of speculation. Wider theories added volume, but not clarity. At the center remained the one man no one could identify, the ghostly figure said to be large, bearded, and persuasive enough to seal an entire family's fate in one night. And so the case circled endlessly around him, never stepping past speculation. If anyone knows his name, they never came forward. If anyone suspected the true location of the Jacks, they never proved it. That gap continues to define the investigation. Yet the greater tragedy did not sit only in mystery. It reached beyond one stranger and became tied to much broader violence in the region. Why does this case stand out among dozens of vanishings? The answer lies in where it happened and the larger story it joins. Highway 16 cuts across northern British Columbia, stretching hundreds of miles through forests, rivers, and small communities. For decades it has been known by another name, the Highway of Tears. That name carries a heavy weight because along that corridor, many Indigenous people, most often women and girls, have gone missing. Their disappearances formed a troubling pattern that families and advocates have pressed governments to acknowledge for years. The vast distances, scarce resources, and systemic neglect created an environment where people were vulnerable, and too often those vulnerabilities were ignored. The Jack family's disappearance sits inside this legacy, but it also stands apart. When Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan vanished in 1989, it echoed stories that communities were already whispering about. Indigenous women who had relied on hitchhiking were disappearing along stretches of the highway. Some were last seen waiting for rides at the edge of rural roads. Others were traveling between small towns for school, work, or family visits. Families reported them missing, but many cases received limited investigation, leaving entire groups of people to wonder if authorities valued their lives with the same urgency as others. In time, law enforcement admitted that dozens of these disappearances shared ties to Highway 16. Researchers and advocates later pointed to poor transportation systems, isolation, systemic racism, and economic stress as the underlying conditions that shaped this crisis. The Jack family's case might not have fit the pattern in the same way. They were not lone travelers, young teenagers, or women accepted into the growing list maintained by advocates. They were a household, living together in what looked like a structured plan. Both parents wanted to accept work at a camp, and they were traveling with their children in the vehicle of a stranger. Their situation removed the element of hitchhiking alone, but instead of separating them from the wider conversation, this difference actually brought attention to the deeper patterns of neglect and danger connected to Highway 16. The disappearance of 4 family members at once made people stop and take notice. If individuals could vanish along the highway without clear answers, that was troubling enough. But an entire family disappearing without trace exposed how fragile safety really was in northern communities. It suggested that vulnerability did not only attach to single women in difficult positions, it extended to parents and children, to whole households, to anyone who found themselves dependent on strangers. The Jacks were not hitchhiking by choice, they lacked a car, and in rural British Columbia at the time, that meant their only way to new opportunities was through someone else's vehicle. That reliance was not unusual. Many Indigenous residents facing unemployment and economic strain shared the same conditions. It showed that what happened to them was not isolated bad luck, but part of a broader web of risks left unaddressed. The physical environment of Highway 16 made the situation even more severe. Communities sit far apart, separated by long stretches of road with no safe rest stops, gas stations, or public facilities for miles. People trying to move between those towns often had no bus lines or affordable transportation. Hitchhiking became the practical, if dangerous, solution. Alongside those realities was the lack of infrastructure set up to protect travelers. Few phone lines, sparse police presence, and the difficulty of searching through dense forest meant that once someone vanished, it was almost impossible to retrace their path. These conditions were well known, families had raised concerns for years, yet transportation systems remained limited. The Jacks lived inside these conditions. Economic strain placed them at the edge of survival. As an indigenous family, they lived with the compounding history of systemic racism and trauma. Their decision to accept the stranger's offer was influenced by desperation, but their reliance on that truck ride also linked them to the broader dangers others already faced on or around Highway 16. In this way, even though their disappearance did not follow the most common profile, it became an example that the crisis was broader than first believed. Entire families could be caught in it, not just individual women. Advocates later pointed to their case as symbolic within the Highway of Tears narrative. Dozens of indigenous women disappeared along that pathway, but the Jack family showed a different possibility: vulnerability at a household level. Doreen had survived the painful experiences of residential school, a structure that removed children from parents and disrupted communities for generations. That system's legacy lingered in indigenous families across the province. Combined with poverty, unemployment, and trauma, those legacies created openings for exploitation. When a stranger offered Ronald the prospect of work that would care for the whole family, it tied into every need they carried. Their agreement to leave home that night was not random. It was the consequence of being left with limited options in a system already failing their community. The wider injustices in the Highway of Tears narrative are reflected in their case. Families often complained that disappearances were not taken seriously by the police during the critical first days. For the Jacks, the RCMP prematurely announced that the family had been found. That mistake deprived them of the timely investigation most needed for recovery. Compare that to many accounts from families of missing women along Highway 16 who recalled similar slow or dismissive responses. Each case might differ in detail, but the systemic barrier repeated across them. Indigenous people vanished, and urgency was often absent in the pursuit of answers. For this reason, the Jack family's disappearance became more than an isolated tragedy. It represented the overlapping layers of trauma, vulnerability, and institutional neglect that defined the Highway of Tears. When activists spoke about the crisis, they did not only name the women who went missing while hitchhiking, they pointed to the Jacks too, as evidence that even full households could be erased under the same shadow of systemic failure. The uniqueness of their loss, 2 parents and 2 boys, made it resonate powerfully. It broadened the perception of who could be at risk. Their absence over the years kept the pressure alive. Families of Highway of Tears victims often joined together to advocate for recognition, better transportation, and greater attention to missing persons. The Jacks' relatives spoke out, reminding people that their tragedy connected to every other name tied to Highway 16. While Russell and Ryan's disappearance as children stood apart from the young women most often remembered, their loss reinforced the larger call for change. A safer transportation system might have reduced the family's reliance on a stranger's vehicle. A more urgent early police response might have boosted the chance of discovery. Both failures highlighted why activism was needed and why systemic change mattered. After their vanishing, the story of Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan circulated alongside the dozens of other names tied to Highway 16. The difference was scale. They were not just one person missing, they were 4. The silence left in their community was multiplied, not only in grief, but in symbolic weight. Their absence grew into one of the most enduring reminders of how deep the crisis of disappearances truly ran. The Jack family's case remains lodged in public memory because it expands the narrative from individuals to entire families, emphasizing that no one was immune. The vanishing of the Jacks became an enduring symbol of the Highway of Tears tragedy, reminding everyone that the risks of neglect, isolation, and systemic inequality did not strike according to age or gender alone. They marked the devastating possibility that an entire family could disappear in one night and be left unfound for decades. The family's absence has fueled decades of advocacy. How do families sustain hope with decades of silence? For the Jack family's relatives, especially Ronald's mother Mabel, this question shaped daily life after 1989. She often spoke about how much her son wanted steady work and how deeply he felt the weight of being unable to provide. To her, the decision to accept the stranger's offer at the pub was not reckless. She saw it as a move made by a desperate man trying to lift his family out of hardship. That understanding, however, did not shield her or others from the pain that followed when Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan disappeared without leaving answers behind. What families confront after a disappearance is not only grief but uncertainty. Loved ones may imagine different outcomes, each one bringing its own kind of anguish. Did something violent happen to the Jacks the night they left? Were they tricked into travelling somewhere remote and then silenced? Without proof, speculation fills the gap, and families have to live with scenarios instead of facts. This silence shapes collective memory, and for the Jacks' relatives, it created frustration with the way the investigation unfolded. They endured the police error in the earliest days of the search, when a false announcement claimed the family had been found safe. Moving forward from that mistake was never easy, because to them, it meant precious time had been lost that might have saved their lives or at least explained their absence. Those frustrations hardened into lasting feelings of neglect. Family members spoke out repeatedly over the years about their belief that authorities did not pursue the investigation with the urgency it deserved. They remained convinced that systemic indifference toward Indigenous families played a central role in how the search for the Jacks was handled. It was not simply a matter of police resources. To them, the silence around updates and the slow pace of follow-up demonstrated unequal treatment in comparison to other missing persons cases happening in Canada around the same years. But silence from investigators did not mean silence from the family. Ronald and Doreen's relatives kept speaking publicly. By doing so, they kept the mystery alive in the eyes of the community. Each interview, each appearance, and every reminder in print or on television worked to prevent the disappearance from fading out of memory. When anniversaries arrived the 5th year, the 10th, the 25th family members reminded the public that the search was still active and that behind the headlines were 2 parents and 2 children whose lives had been taken away from those who loved them. This persistence also connected with Indigenous advocacy across British Columbia and Canada. The Jack family's experience became part of wider calls for justice in missing and murdered Indigenous cases. Advocates stressed that systemic neglect was not an abstract problem. It resulted in families like the Jacks left without clear answers and without confidence in support from the agencies tasked with protecting them. The scale of disappearances along Highway 16, remembered as the Highway of Tears, meant the Jack story fit inside a painful national narrative. Their disappearance stood not only as a personal loss, but also as evidence that broader changes were necessary. Community efforts helped carry the story forward. Documentaries began to cover the Jack case as part of wider presentations on Highway 16. These productions gave space to family members to share memories of Ronald, of Doreen, and of their children. The goal was not only to describe the mystery, but to preserve their humanity. By speaking about who the Jacks were before their disappearance, the projects ensured they were seen as more than just names on a file. Social media later provided another platform, allowing advocates and community members to continue drawing attention to the case long after mainstream headlines had died out. These posts circulated photos, case summaries, and appeals for information that reached audiences across Canada and beyond. For the family itself, the loss did not end with one generation. Generational grief shaped their lives. Children who were cousins or nieces and nephews of Russell and Ryan grew up hearing about the disappearance. The memory of the Jacks became part of their identity, a reminder of how their family had been fractured by the events of 1989. Trauma in such families is not temporary. It weaves itself into family stories, traditions, and the way people approach the world around them. Each new generation carries that silence forward, both as pain and as motivation to keep searching for answers. In public, the family maintained clarity about what they believed mattered. Time and again, they reminded others not to be distracted by sensational theories involving serial killers. While some members of the public linked the disappearance to high-profile names like Robert Picton, the family reiterated that these links were unproven and unhelpful. To them, one truth stood above speculation. Ronald met a man at the pub who offered him work, and that was the last confirmed contact the family had before they vanished. Everything pointed back to that moment. The stranger in the bar remained central and remained real. Chasing legends about distant criminals only shifted focus away from the specific person who had been sitting across from Ronald, sharing drinks and making promises. This insistence on truth over myth kept the investigation's core alive. Journalists returning to the case decades later repeated the family's message. If the man at the pub could be named, then understanding might finally follow. By anchoring the story in that encounter, the family and their supporters preserved its focus, even when other theories tried to widen it into unsolvable territory. The persistence of loved ones has been the reason the Jack family remains present in public discussion today. Without their voices, the case might have been absorbed into the general shadow of the Highway of Tears. Instead, it has continued to stand out. More than 30 years later, Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan are still invoked in national discussions about missing Indigenous people. Their family, their names, and their fate are pressed into awareness by relatives who never accepted silence as an answer. That persistence is the mini payoff in a story otherwise filled with unanswered questions. Because their relatives refused to stop speaking, the disappearance of the Jacks did not vanish with them. It stayed alive in public memory, preserved not only in official police records, but in the collective awareness of people across British Columbia and Canada. These efforts ensured that while the investigation stumbled, forgetfulness would not erase their existence. And yet, after decades of sustained memory, the Jacks case is still unresolved. The silence that began in 1989 has stretched forward, untouched by resolutions or confirmed discoveries. Each retelling reinforces the unresolved nature of the story while sustaining its presence. What remains is a community living with the unanswered questions, and a family carrying grief that has crossed generations. Decades of unanswered questions leave the case unresolved, but unforgettable. What does it mean for an entire family to remain missing? Most disappearances involve an individual. A young woman who never makes it home. A man who leaves for work and fails to return. People vanish every year, and those stories leave behind holes for loved ones. But when the Jacks disappeared, it was not one person. It was 4 members of the same family, taken out of daily life in a single night. More than 3 decades later, nothing has been confirmed about their fate. No bodies, no possessions, not a trace. The silence surrounding them has left the case frozen, as though time itself stopped on that August night in 1989. This is the nature of the mystery. Their last known hours are clear enough. Ronald meeting a man in a bar, telling relatives about the job, preparing to leave with Doreen and the boys, and stepping into a pickup truck after midnight. After that, nothing. There are no bank withdrawals, there are no employment records, no phone calls, no sightings. People disappear for many reasons, but often investigators can trace a departure through paper trails or accidents that eventually show up. Here, it is as if the Jacks erased themselves from every system the moment they left their front door. It is the lack of traceability at every level that makes this case so haunting. When families disappear in stories of conflict or disaster, there are sometimes remains to account for their lives. There are names etched into archives or items left behind that speak for them. In the case of the Jacks, the overnight erasure leaves almost nothing. It can be difficult to imagine how 4 people, 2 adults and 2 children, could vanish without evidence. Some missing people are folded into public systems through school enrollments, hospital visits, paychecks, or welfare interactions. For the Jacks, all of that ended at once. Government records that should show signs of their lives, like school attendance or medical treatments, stopped completely after August 1989. The family has been suspended in absence ever since, their place in everyday registers of life gone overnight. The investigation remains open. That fact matters. Even decades later, law enforcement will confirm that the Jack family's case has not been closed. Files have been revisited, tips continue to be received, and the anonymous phone call from 1996 remains inside the records. But an open file without resolution also highlights the frustration. People know the family is missing. Authorities acknowledge the facts, but there has never been enough detail to move it from mystery into tragedy with clarity. The open case represents not only a desire to keep searching, but also an admission of defeat that for 30 years, investigators have held no solid ground to stand on. For the families left behind, this suspension places grief into limbo. When a loved one dies, even under difficult circumstances, rituals and mourning allow families to begin moving forward. When someone is missing, those processes cannot begin in the same way. The Jack family's relatives had to live with the uncertainty. They could not bury them. They could not know whether to grieve or continue to hope. Living between those states is exhausting, and that exhaustion has stretched across generations. Ronald's mother, brothers, nieces, and nephews all carried the weight. For the children of that extended family, the story of the disappearance became part of the memory they inherited. It pulled trauma forward, shaping their experiences, even though many were too young to remember Ronald and Doreen themselves. The cultural impact has been significant as well. As Indigenous people of British Columbia, the Jack family's disappearance ties into a larger story of systemic loss. The Highway of Tears stands as a corridor linked with dozens of disappearances, most involving Indigenous women. The Jacks became part of that narrative, a reminder that entire units of family life could be destroyed by neglect and violence. Their absence highlights generational trauma, not only from the possibility of crime, but also from inadequate answers. In communities already marked by the history of residential schools, the loss of 4 more members under unexplained conditions strikes at the heart of cultural continuity. The Jacks' disappearance is not just a family's grief, it is part of what Indigenous activists describe as collective loss, where silence from authorities mirrors the erasures long experienced in their histories. For many, The Jack family is remembered not as individuals, but as a symbol of uncertainty. They became part of the broader pattern of missing Indigenous persons in Canada. Families folded into statistics and lists of unresolved cases. But it is vital to remember there were real children here. Russell was 9 years old, Ryan was 4. When their names vanish into the official record, the human scale can be overlooked. To say an entire family disappeared is to simplify the reality of two boys with friends, parents, and futures that never continued. It is one thing for an individual life to be suspended, it is another for childhoods to evaporate in silence, leaving no sign of growth, no photographs beyond 1989. The tension of their disappearance rests in these unanswered details. Who exactly drove the truck? Did the camp by Klukul's Lake ever exist? Was the anonymous caller speaking truth about a ranch burial, or was it manipulation? Every question exists in possibility, but none have been resolved. For those who live with the story, this constant speculation becomes its own form of suffering. They cannot rest in certainty, because every corner of the case leads to another what if. In turn, the Jacks are carved into public history, not through discovery, but through absence. What does justice look like when the trail is this cold? That question underscores the story now. There will always be the sense that if the initial handling by police had been different, the outcome might have shifted. If the error of prematurely declaring the family found had not drained precious momentum, perhaps clues could have led to recovery. If investigations had spanned ranch properties more aggressively, maybe the words of the anonymous caller would have been tested more fully. Instead, the reality is that 30 years later, the physical world holds no clear sign of the Jacks. Justice is murky when not even the truth of the crime is known. As years pass, memories fade, and potential witnesses age and die. Each decade reduces the chance of fresh discovery. What remains instead are stories told within families, and the cultural resonance that keeps the lost part of collective awareness. The Jacks remain frozen at the point of their disappearance, unaged and incomplete. They are remembered as they looked the day they left. Ronald and Doreen as a young couple, Russell as a boy of 9, Ryan as a 4-year-old child. To their relatives, they are fixed this way. To the public, they are the embodiment of an unresolved case stretched across generations. The Jack family's disappearance is not only a mystery, but a symbol of unanswered questions that refuse to fade. It represents the failures of an investigative system, the vulnerabilities of Indigenous families, and the cost of silence extended over lifetimes. The file remains open because nothing can be proven, but that open status is itself a weight. It means that resolution is still possible, but each year makes it less likely. And this unresolved ending is the lasting weight of their disappearance. Jack family's disappearance shows how desperation can reshape judgment. Faced with poverty, unemployment, and trauma, Ronald and Doreen placed their trust in a stranger who seemed to offer hope. That choice reflects the vulnerability many families face when the safety net of society fails them. This case remains unsolved. More than 3 decades later, there are still no answers, no remains, and no closure for their loved ones. Their story highlights systemic neglect and the dangers faced by Indigenous families. After all these years, Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan remain missing, one of Canada's most enduring and haunting mysteries. Welcome back again. Tonight we will cover a shocking true crime case from Germany with a lot of bizarre twists. Before we start, please like this video and comment down below what time it is wherever you are right now. Let's get to it. 6 months before the Hinterkaifeck murders, the family's maid suddenly quit, claiming the farm was haunted. Weeks later, Andreas Gruber found footprints in fresh snow that led directly to his home, but none leaving it. And then there was the strange newspaper from Munich he swore he never bought. These were the first ripples of something far darker. On March 31, 1922, a new maid arrived. By the next day, every person on the farm would be dead. What happened in those hours remains one of Germany's most unsettling riddles. It started with something small enough to wave away. Andreas Gruber noticed a newspaper from Munich lying in his home. It wasn't the sudden arrival of a letter or a strange item of value, but an ordinary paper. The problem was, he hadn't bought it, and no one else in his family claimed they had either. On any other farm closer to town, this might have been explained easily. Perhaps a neighbour dropped it off by mistake, or a visitor left it behind. But Hinterkaifeck was not like other farms. It stood alone, a half-mile from the nearest house, and surrounded by thick woods on one side and open fields on the other. The path that led there didn't see casual travellers. Strangers appeared only when they had business. In March 1922, life in rural Bavaria moved slowly, especially for families that farmed their own land. Deliveries or visitors were rare enough to be memorable. For that reason, finding a city newspaper that belonged to no one in the household was not just unexpected, it was strange. The home was days removed from Munich, and they had no regular reason to receive periodicals from there. Newspapers were paid for and delivered on schedule, not randomly. That meant someone had carried it onto the property. Andreas asked his wife, Cecilia, and his daughter, Victoria, if they had bought it or received it from a friend. Both said no. He asked again a day later. The answer was the same. At some point he mentioned it to a neighbour, hoping they might say they had stopped by and left it. None had. The newspaper remained without an origin, and there was no one else to ask. With only a few farms scattered in the area, each resident knew who passed through and why. Mail carriers could be accounted for. Regular tradesmen were trusted. No one could recall bringing a Munich newspaper to Hinterkaifeck. It was a loose end that would have been easy to brush away in a busier place, but here, in the stillness of the countryside, it carried weight. The question was whether this was simply an accident or the work of someone making a deliberate choice. Was it possible it had been dropped by a traveller cutting across the land? Almost no one had reason to take that route, especially in early spring when the ground was still soft and muddy in patches. If someone had walked all the way up, they would have been seen or left signs of their visit. The idea that it might have been intentional nagged at him. If it was, then the motive for leaving it could be more than just kindness or carelessness. Even without knowing the term, it might match what's now called a test intrusion. It's a small, low-risk way for someone to confirm whether a person notices an outside presence. Criminals or stalkers sometimes use minor disruptions, moving an object, leaving something behind, or creating a subtle disturbance to see how their target reacts. If the homeowner responds strongly, the attempt might be abandoned. If they seem not to notice or don't act on it, the intruder may feel bolder. Andreas brought the newspaper inside and kept it. Whether that was out of curiosity or because he thought it might still be useful isn't clear, but he did not involve the police. In the rural culture of the time, involving law enforcement over something so minor risked ridicule. The expectation was to solve small mysteries privately, or to let them drop. He may have also considered that reporting it would require travel, time away from the farm, and an admission that he had no clue how it appeared. As the days passed, he seemed to accept the lack of an answer. The absence of other signs, no missing items, no broken locks, no scattered possessions, made it easier to file the incident away. The newspaper sat as a harmless but unexplained object, no longer a point of daily discussion. In hindsight, it stood out because of everything that would follow, but at the moment, it was a small irregularity in an otherwise ordered life. On farms like Hinterkaifeck, routines were tight, animals were tended at specific times, tools returned to their places, and family members accounted for. The unexpected was rare enough to matter, yet even then, human nature leans toward assuming innocence over malice when there's little evidence to the contrary. Still, a single, unexplained detail can be a warning that's only recognized later. In this case, the warning might have been that someone knew the family's habits well enough to come onto the property undetected. In a community where every visit was noticed, that suggested familiarity and patience. Whoever left the paper wouldn't have had to force a way in. They could walk up the long track, stay hidden until the right moment, enter or approach quietly, and leave something in plain sight. The fact that no one saw or heard them meant they understood the rhythms of the people living there. In modern cases, where similar patterns occur, investigators sometimes describe finding evidence showing an intruder had been close, but not yet committed the crime. Sometimes they find items moved in sheds, padlocks tampered with but left closed, or harmless objects, like notes or newspapers, left where the homeowner can see them. The behavior is cautious, almost experimental. Had Andreas taken the newspaper as more than an annoyance, or at least told more of the neighbouring farmers, there might have been a collective decision to keep watch or to note unfamiliar faces in the area. A single family could be watched without them knowing, but watching a whole rural community unnoticed was far harder. Instead, the incident remained private, known only within the household, and possibly one or two neighbours who could offer no answers. That privacy may have been intentional. In small villages, spreading word about a puzzling event could start rumours. Not all attention would be helpful, especially for a family already carrying whispers about their personal lives. The Grubers had their reasons for wanting to limit talk about what happened on their land. Maintaining control over information gave them the final say on what was important and what wasn't. It's also possible pride played a part. A man of Andreas's generation was expected to protect his household without needing outside help. Admitting a stranger had approached without his knowledge might be too close to admitting weakness. Discretion in such matters was often seen as a form of strength, even if it left questions unanswered. If the paper was a test, the result would have told the person responsible exactly what they wanted to know, that they could enter the property, leave something, and face no immediate consequences. The family didn't change their routines in response. They didn't call for extra help, or patrols, or keep watch at night. Nothing about life on the farm shifted in the wake of the discovery. That stability, so important to the smooth running of the place, might have also been reassuring to anyone watching from outside. Over time, the unusualness of finding a Munich paper in the middle of an isolated Bavarian farm would fade in memory. But human memory also has a way of sharpening old moments when later events give them new meaning. In the week before the crime, several smaller incidents were recalled by those still alive to speak about them. The newspaper became the first in that chain, not because it was the most threatening, but because it was the earliest sign at which a choice could have been made to respond differently. When viewed on its own, it could have been a curiosity at best, the kind of thing that calls up short-lived conversation at the family table. But history shows it as a marker, the point where the trail begins to darken. At the time, no one at Hinterkaifeck treated it as a call to action, and so it became a footnote, until the events that followed brought it into sharp focus as the first visible ripple of something much larger. That larger pattern didn't take long to grow. Within weeks, other signs of intrusion began to surface. None were as harmless-looking as a newspaper left on a table, and each would press harder against the boundary between a private farm and the world beyond it. As the family kept their worries close, the quiet isolation that made the place feel safe would begin to change, and with it, so would the sense of control they thought they had over their own land. It was still cold enough for snow to lie across the fields when Andreas Gruber saw them. A line of clear footprints stretched across the white crust from the edge of the woods to the farmhouse. Each step pressed deep and sharp, showing the tread of heavy boots. They ended at the door, and then stopped. There were no imprints leading away, no signs of someone circling back. The only tracks visible were the ones that came in. Winter at Hinterkaifeck was quiet. With no other farms in close sight, snow stayed untouched for days, unless the family or their animals disturbed it. Anyone walking toward the house would stand out plainly. Fresh snow was like a record of movement, and here that record told a troubling story. Someone had walked all the way up, but never appeared to leave. The conditions made it hard to imagine a reasonable explanation. This was not melting spring slush where marks could blur. The snow was firm, and light had not yet softened it. To erase the return path would have taken deliberate effort, like stepping in exactly the same prints or covering them. The way the trail ended so cleanly at the threshold suggested neither wind nor accident. For Andreas, it was another puzzle to add to what had already been sitting in his mind. In that same period, he noticed the front door lock had been broken. It was a heavy, well-worn lock that had endured years of use, but now it hung out of alignment. It could still catch if pulled just right, but it no longer felt solid. The broken lock and the unexplained tracks made for a strange combination. One could be dismissed as weather damage or age, the other as a traveller passing by. Together, they hinted at someone not only reaching the farm, but trying to get inside, or at least testing how secure the entrance was. In a city, an unlocked door might not stand out as dangerous. On an isolated farm, it could mean that the barrier between inside and out was one shove from giving way. Andreas spoke about the footprints to a few neighbours over the next day or so. In a close rural community, such news travelled quickly between farmsteads. Visiting each other was part of life, and so was sharing concerns about strangers in the area. Some neighbours offered to come by after dark to keep an eye out or to help mend the lock. They did not treat his story lightly. In the early 1920s, theft from remote farms was not unheard of, and a bold intruder could do serious harm before anyone could respond. Help was a natural thing to offer, but Andreas turned it down. He said he could manage the matter himself. Whatever his reasons, they ended the conversation there. No formal warning went out to others along the road, and no one arranged a watch on the property. Even for those who suspected the situation might be more serious, pressing the matter was not the way things were done. A man's word that he had it in hand was often the final word. His refusal could have been shaped by many things. Pride was one, as head of the household. Admitting he could not secure his own home might be seen as weakness. Privacy was another. The Gruber family's personal life already drew whispers in the hamlet, and more visitors poking around might feed them. Fear may have played a part too. If the person who left those tracks was still nearby, facing them could risk more than a missing lock. There was also the possibility he simply did not believe the threat was real. Without direct confrontation, the idea of someone watching from the trees might seem too unlikely to warrant altering the daily routine, what would stand out later was not just the existence of the footprints, but the fact that they were ignored. In hindsight, they looked like an early sign of an intruder mapping the approach to the house. This is something investigators in modern cases note. Persons intending to break in sometimes test routes and timing before acting, making approaches to see if anyone notices. A trail in came without one going back might mean the person entered and stayed, slipping out hours later under the cover of night or through another path. If so, they could have been close enough to watch the family without being seen. At the time, though, with work to be done and animals to tend, life pressed on. A farm in late winter still demanded constant effort. Skipping chores or changing patterns over what could be dismissed as an odd track was not easy to justify, especially when each day brought tasks that could not be postponed. That thinking made sense to people who measured danger by immediate harm. Without clear evidence of theft or violence, the risk felt distant. The reality of rural Bavaria then was that homes were often left unlatched or with only simple locks. Trust in one's surroundings was high, and the space between neighbours meant not every approach to a house was seen. Even so, the prince bothered Andreas enough to mention them, and for others to recall his account later. But they did not prompt a safeguard or a search. Those who heard about the tracks before the murders would remember later how clear Andreas was about them stopping at the building. The image of boots cutting straight to the door but nowhere else took on a sinister shape after the killings. In reconstructing events, investigators would see it as evidence that someone familiar with the farm had been scouting it. With no return path to show, the most logical reading was that they had found shelter there, at least for hours. The broken lock's role is harder to pinpoint. Whether it was forced during that approach or had already been weakened, its failure would mean easier entry. If the killer had tried the door then, they might have learned just how simply they could step through later. Combined with the lack of immediate action from the family, it could have encouraged a second visit, one that would not end with only footprints in the snow. Small rural crimes then often followed a similar pattern. Visible signs that went unchallenged, followed by bolder acts. Without police called in early, because travel took time or the incident seemed minor, those acts could escalate without warning. For Hinterkaifeck, the escalation would come quietly. The prints in the snow were the sort of clue that only felt urgent once the outcome was known. By keeping the matter private, Andreas limited the number of eyes watching over the property. Neighbours could not help notice someone lurking if they did not know what to look for. That choice preserved privacy, but also left space for any intruder to move freely. From the outside, no sign showed that the family felt unsafe. Daily routines stayed visible, tending animals, moving between barn and house, crossing the yard. That steadiness, under most conditions a strength, could also tell a hidden watcher that nothing had changed from their first visit. It is possible Andreas believed that simply locking up more carefully would be enough, or that whoever came had already taken what they wanted. Either way, the farm did not see extra protection after the tracks. No neighbour was asked to stay the night. No tools moved near the house for defence. On paper, the incident ended as soon as the old prints were covered by new snow. Yet after the murders, that line of steps frozen in white became one of the most telling prelude scenes. Investigators piecing together the timeline could point to it as one of several events, showing someone approaching the family before the attack. Each of these moments could be seen as probes, quiet, limited actions to learn about the household. First a newspaper appearing without cause, then the solitary track stopping at the door. Both carried the message that an unseen presence had reached the farm without being confronted. The neighbours' offers of aid, turned away without much debate, became the missed chance to build a wall of awareness around the Grubers. In small communities, word about suspicious movement could make strangers stand out sharply. But that chance passed, and isolation kept the family on their usual path. No extra eyes, no disruption to the watcher's comfort. This refusal of help and the decision to keep possible dangers unspoken would mark the next weeks. Even as new worries arose, they would stay contained within the farmyard, and with each unchallenged sign, the space between feeling safe and being safe became harder to see. 6 months before the murders, the family's maid made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She had been with the Grubers for some time, long enough to know their habits and the rhythm of life on the farm. Work was steady, the pay was certain, and positions like hers were not easy to come by in rural Bavaria during the early 1920s. Yet she quit suddenly, and the reason she gave was that she believed the farmhouse was haunted. By then, she had seen enough of the property to understand that its location meant it was quiet, often without visitors for days. But she told people the quiet was not what troubled her. It was the noises, sounds she could not explain, especially coming from the attic. She said she heard footsteps above when everyone she knew was downstairs. Sometimes it was the creaking of the floorboards overhead. Other times it was faint but deliberate movement, as if someone was pacing. The attic was only used for storage, and there was no good reason for anyone to be up there at night. Yet the sounds persisted. The sense of being watched bothered her even more. She began to feel it while doing ordinary work, like hanging laundry in the yard or cleaning in the kitchen. The feeling was strongest when she was alone, and although she never saw anyone, she described it as if eyes were on her from somewhere just out of sight. In a farmhouse surrounded by open land, that feeling did not fade when the workday ended. It followed her into the evening and into her sleeping hours. Rural Bavaria, at the time, was a place where belief in the supernatural was common. Stories about spirits, haunted places, or bad omens were shared without much hesitation. A claim of haunting might not have been dismissed in the way it would be in a city. For the maid, those beliefs shaped how she interpreted what she was experiencing. Strange noises in the attic, the constant sense of being watched, these were part of her reason for thinking the place itself was not right. She stayed for a while, perhaps trying to adapt, but over time the decision to leave formed. Economic reality made that choice unusual. It was not a time when people quit stable work without a plan. Many domestic workers relied on those positions to support themselves and, often, to send money to family members. Leaving without another job lined up could mean weeks or months of hardship. That she made this choice shows how seriously the unease had taken hold. When she left, the Gruber household lost not just a worker, but a pair of hands that lightened the load. Life on a farm meant long hours of labor from early morning until after dark. Household work and outdoor work both needed attention, and without the maid, more of that burden fell on the family itself. Cecilia took on more household duties. Victoria helped with both chores and farming work, and Andreas balanced his time between tending to the animals, managing the fields, and keeping the property in order. Losing a worker was a setback, especially in the lead-up to winter. Her departure was mentioned later during the investigation into the murders. It stood out because it was one of the first pieces of information in which an outsider had expressed clear discomfort about the property. Other events, like the newspaper or the footprints, were kept mostly within the family or shared only with a few neighbors. This was different. The maid told people in plain terms that she did not want to stay there. Her reason, haunting, might not have been the language investigators would use, but it meant she believed the place was unsafe for reasons she could not fully explain. Later speculation suggested she might have sensed something more tangible than a haunting. Some who have studied the case have wondered if the noises she described could have been a person hiding in the attic. The idea is not without precedent. In other crimes, intruders have been found to live secretly in parts of houses for days or weeks, moving around quietly to avoid detection. From her point of view, she did not have proof of an intruder, only the repeated experience of hearing movements when no family member was in that part of the building. It is difficult to say whether the Grubers believed her account or thought it was imagination. In close-knit rural communities, accusations of a haunted house could bring unwanted attention. Superstition was common, but farming families often faced a clash between such beliefs and practical concerns. A belief in spirits might lead some to avoid a place, but publicly admitting fear like that could lead others to dismiss you as unreliable. If Andreas or Cecilia feared that talking about strange noises would invite gossip about the property, they may have chosen to downplay the maid's claims. Her absence also had a subtle effect on the family's self-sufficiency. With fewer people to split the labor, they spent more time on routine tasks, leaving less energy for maintaining security or noticing small changes in their surroundings. The additional workload could mean doors were locked less regularly if hands were busy elsewhere, or that animals were tended before daylight or after dark when visibility was low. In these conditions, an outsider trying to get close to the farm would face fewer moments when someone was free to watch the yard closely. From a modern viewpoint, her departure is a clear marker. It was the first human voice to say that living there had become intolerable. Unlike objects left behind or footprints, which require interpretation, her leaving was an action, taken despite the cost to herself, that pointed to something wrong. Investigators could only guess, however, whether what she felt was linked to the later murders. Without knowing exactly what caused the noises or the feeling she described, it remained a piece of the puzzle, but not one that could be confirmed. The timing of her decision is also worth noting. 6 months is a long gap before the crime, and yet it is close enough that the conditions she faced could have had some connection to the events that followed. If there was an intruder or someone watching the farm at that earlier date, they may have been studying the family for months before acting. If that is the case, the maid's experiences would have been an early symptom of a much longer plan. In a case where so little is certain, her story adds to the outline of unease that seemed to build in stages. First, A worker inside the home leaves because the environment feels threatening. Then, over the next months, strange signs appear outside. Objects where they should not be, tracks leading in but not out, locks damaged. Each step might have felt isolated to those living there, but from the outside, it forms a chain. The family did eventually hire another maid, but there was a long stretch without one. In that time, they adapted to working without extra help. That meant whoever joined them next would be coming into a household with a lot of responsibility resting on each person's shoulders. The replacement would also be stepping into a property with a recent history of odd disturbances, and in her case, into the very end of that story. The departure 6 months earlier had removed one witness from the household, someone who could have noticed and spoken about more of the strange activity. By the time the position was filled again, the tension on the farm had shifted into its final phase. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, would arrive under circumstances that neither she nor the family could know were already set against them. She would not have the same months of warning the previous maid had felt. For her, the beginning and the end would come on the same day. Despite the strange events around the farm, Andreas Gruber did not want extra eyes watching over his land. In the months leading up to the murders, neighbors noticed his reluctance to accept help that, in most situations, would have been taken for granted. He had already spoken to some of them about the footprints in the snow and the broken door lock. These were not small details in a place where people knew who belonged and who did not. Yet when men from nearby homes offered to stay the night or check the property at odd hours, he turned them down. The surrounding community was typical of rural Bavaria at the time. Families ran their farms with the understanding that neighbors would assist each other when needed. That applied to harvests, livestock trouble, bad weather, or any sign of suspicious activity. Distance between houses meant that it might take a while for someone to reach you, but once word spread, help followed. People often left tools in shared sheds or checked on each other's property if they were passing by. In that culture, refusing assistance was unusual, especially after mentioning concerns that someone might have been on your land uninvited. Gruber's refusals stood out because they went against the unspoken rules of the hamlet. You might guard your privacy on personal matters, but when it came to a possible threat, it was common sense to involve others. The offers to guard or investigate were practical. One neighbor remembered suggesting they could keep watch in the nights for a while to see if the stranger came back. The suggestion cost nothing but time. It did not risk public scandal, but Andreas chose to keep all responsibility within his household. The reasons for his stance were never put in writing. Those who knew him said he was a proud man, capable of managing his own affairs. Pride alone, though, might not explain the pattern. There was also the matter of the family's reputation. Rumors about Andreas and his daughter Victoria had circulated in the area before. The documented fact of their incestuous relationship had led to legal trouble years earlier. While people might still work alongside the Grubers in daily matters, the scandal remained part of their reputation. Allowing outsiders to linger at the farm could revive the talk or invite more attention to the family's private life. Mistrust could have factored in as well. In small agricultural communities, disputes over boundaries, livestock, and debts were common. Even among neighbors you greeted daily, there could be quiet grudges. If Andreas suspected that someone nearby might be involved in the disturbances, even indirectly, he would be unlikely to invite them into the heart of his property after dark. Declining offers avoided the need to share details he was not prepared to discuss. Fear is another possibility. For all his firmness with others, living with a sense that someone might be watching the farm could have made him cautious about involving anyone who might become a target. In that way, handling it alone may have felt safer, even if it actually left the family more vulnerable. Without knowing exactly who left the newspaper, made the footprints, or handled the lock, he may have believed that keeping quiet was a defense of its own. Whatever the reason, those decisions meant that no outsider kept watch over the farm at night. Opportunities to patrol, to spot an unfamiliar figure near the barn, were lost. In hindsight, each refused offer looks like a moment when someone might have noticed movements or heard sounds that the family did not. An intruder who knew the area could see that no extra help had arrived, no lights burned later than usual, and no dogs from other farms were being walked near the property to disturb the quiet. They could plan without interference. The refusal to involve the local authority also meant no official record was made of the earlier events. The police never heard about the strange newspaper, the footprints that stopped at the door, or the broken lock until after the murders. In a small district like that, word from the police to watch for strangers would have spread quickly. Without it, the intruder's movements went unnoticed beyond Hinterkaifeck itself. Some neighbors later questioned whether Andreas knew more than he had ever told them. That was speculation, but it grew from the way he balanced acknowledgement of the strange events with a clear unwillingness to act on them publicly. If he had a private suspicion, whether about a specific person or a hidden cause, He did not share it. For the investigators who pieced together the timeline, that gap became part of the mystery. They could not tell if his silence had been protective, stubborn, or based on information he refused to reveal. Refusals alone do not cause a crime, but they shape the conditions before it happens. Here, they meant the intruder had weeks, maybe months, without increased risk of discovery. In remote areas, even one extra person watching could drastically cut down on opportunities for someone to approach unseen. Without that, approaches to the barn or house could be tested at different times of day, and paths in and out could be learned without anyone intervening. Looking back from modern policing standards, the pattern is stark. Now, when small rural properties report unexplained entries or damage, police often encourage immediate sharing of details with the community. Even if there is not enough evidence for a charge, the extra awareness makes intrusion harder. In the 1920s, Community Watch worked only if the homeowner opened the door to it. In this case, that door stayed closed. It is also worth noting that in that era, the lines between home, farm, and field were more open than today. Boundaries were not always fenced, or if they were, they might be easy to cross. Larger livestock fields were shared spaces at certain times of year. Visitors or workers from outside the family could come onto the property without every step being noticed, and if no one had been told to watch for suspicious behavior, they would pass without a word. Without a signal from Andreas that the household was on alert, the people nearby would see nothing out of the ordinary. His refusal of aid also reinforces how isolated the family was, beyond the physical distance from other homes. It was a social isolation created by choice in some ways, and possibly by the lingering effects of scandal in others. In a place where much of life depended on trust and exchange, breaking that pattern effectively narrowed the circle of people with a reason to check in on you unasked. That left only close family in the loop, and in this case, close family meant the same 4 adults, who would soon be among the victims. The offers of help were simple: an extra set of eyes, occasional nights spent on the property, repairs to the lock. Declining them left the family to manage risk within their own resources. That might have been enough in ordinary times, but if the disturbances were the work of someone preparing for a bigger act, it meant their work went ahead without disruption. The intruder already knew how far the farm was from neighbours. Learning that no one else would be moving in and out was likely one more confirmation that the farm could be approached on the intruder's terms. Every community has its own ways of managing danger. In Hinterkaifeck, the standard was mutual surveillance through regular interaction. Neighbours noticed who passed by, noted wagons or figures in the fields where they did not belong, and made mental lists of when a family was away. By shutting out those habits, Andreas took on full responsibility for identifying and deterring threats. That choice, whether made out of pride, mistrust, privacy, or fear, meant that no one outside the family could say what happened on the property in the days before the murders. To the investigators, that meant key opportunities were gone before they even began. The small moments when someone might have been spotted, a cart might have been traced, or tracks might have been followed, simply never occurred. The isolation was not just a feature of the farm's location. It was a result of deliberate decisions about who got to see inside the circle of trust. Those decisions could not be undone once the crime happened, but they shaped the path the case would take. At the heart of it, the refusals were part of the steady background to life at Hinterkaifeck during that winter and early spring. The family experienced unusual events but held them close, dealing with them on their own terms. To people outside, nothing seemed urgent enough to push past the family's wishes. And so the weeks passed, the ground thawed, and life on the farm continued its same patterns until the day a new maid arrived, stepping into those patterns just as they were about to be broken forever. On the afternoon of March 31, 1922, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck. She had travelled with her sister, who had agreed to escort her to the farm. After helping her settle in, her sister left, making her one of the last people outside the family to see them alive. The visit was not intended to be noteworthy. Maria had come to start a new job, one that would provide her with work and a place to live. She was stepping into a household she did not know well, and as far as anyone can tell, she had no awareness that this job would end before it had truly begun. There is little recorded about Maria's life before she came to Hinterkaifeck. Many domestic workers in rural Bavaria at the time came from nearby towns or villages, often sent by family or finding work through acquaintances. The work was steady but demanding. Duties could range from preparing meals and cleaning to helping with light farm tasks if needed. For some, the room and board arrangements made these jobs more appealing than seasonal labour or factory work, especially in smaller communities. Maria's placement at Hinterkaifeck followed the usual pattern. She would live in the house, take her meals with the family, and be on hand for both household and occasional farm help. Maria could not have known that this isolated property had been the site of months of strange and unexplained activity. Andreas Gruber had not shared the details of the odd newspaper that appeared in the home, the footprints that came only toward the house in the snow, or the broken lock on the front door. The earlier maid's departure after hearing noises in the attic was also a matter kept within a small circle. From Maria's perspective, she was coming into a new role in a quiet, rural homestead. The Grubers had work for her, a room ready upstairs, and there was no sign that she should expect anything unusual. Her journey to the farm likely started earlier that day in a nearby town. The exact train schedules are not preserved, but it would have been common to travel by local rail, or a combination of rail and cart, to reach a place like Hinterkaifeck. The last part of the trip was by foot or wagon, along the track that led from the hamlet to the isolated farmhouse. There were open fields on either side, and a stretch of woods in the distance. Like others seeing the farm for the first time, Maria would have noticed the wide yard, the well-built barn connected to the living quarters, and the house's simple two-story design. Her sister saw her to the door. Inside, Maria met the family she would be working for, Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their adult daughter Victoria, and her two children, also named Cecilia and Joseph. The routine would have been explained briefly, including meals at certain times, assigned chores, and the expectations for her first days. Whether the Grubers mentioned that they had been without a maid for months is not recorded, but they must have recognized some relief in having help again. Maria took her things to the upstairs room where she would be sleeping. This was a private space, possibly furnished with a small bed, a table, and a washstand. Attic rooms in rural homes were often cold in late March, with the lingering chill of winter still in the air, but they were separate from the main family bedrooms. From her window, she may have seen part of the yard and the fields beyond. Looking inside at this stage, there was no visible hint of the unease that had been slowly building on the property for months. While Maria unpacked and settled into her room, the family went about their daily late afternoon routines. Animals needed feeding in the barn, and the evening meal had to be prepared. The farm would have been busy, but not frantic. Spring work was beginning, but this was not the peak of harvest. For Maria, the pace and setting were likely exactly what she expected from a job description: a working farm with a need for steady upkeep, and a household that relied on regular, coordinated effort. The timing of her arrival placed her directly in the path of what was about to happen. She had stepped into the story when the series of small, unexplained events was about to reach its conclusion. To her, this was simply her first day of employment. To investigators looking back, this was the moment the last person entered the house before the killings took place. She was the final change in the household before the attack. There is no evidence to suggest she was uneasy or suspicious during those hours. The afternoon passed in ordinary tasks, such as meeting the family, putting belongings in place, and perhaps lending a hand in the kitchen. Conversations would have been about schedules, routines, and what was expected. No one stopped to tell her that 2 nights earlier Andreas had turned down offers from neighbors to stay on the property, or that throughout the winter there had been incidents no one could explain. Her sister's departure left Maria in the company of the Grubers alone. That shift from the outside world to the closed environment of the farm was a natural part of domestic service, and Maria had no way to know she was also stepping into the final hours of everyone's lives. The isolation that might have felt peaceful to someone unfamiliar with the warnings would, to those aware of the situation, also mean that any danger approaching the farm would have no rival for miles. At that time of year, daylight faded early. As the sun dropped, animals were secured for the night, and doors latched against the cool air. Lamps or candles inside provided a small circle of light in each room, leaving the outer edges of the yard dark. Maria's upstairs room, being away from the busiest part of the house, would have been a quiet place early in the evening. From there, she might have heard the muted movement of the family below, the low noises from the barn as animals settled, or the wind passing outside. Those simple sensory details were part of what made the hours appear uneventful in the moment. It is only in the context of the crime that this calmness feels like the surface stillness before something irreversible. The caretaker's presence in her room was as normal as Andreas moving between the house and barn, or Victoria readying her children for bed. Everything seemed routine, right up until the moment it was not. The important thing about this point in the timeline is that Maria arrived during the last stage of a long, hidden progression. She had not been there for the newspaper left without explanation, for the footprints that came to the house but not away, or for the broken lock. She had not seen the prior maid's discomfort. She had no background to connect those dots, and no reason to take special caution. That made her, without knowing it, as vulnerable as the rest. Her arrival also shows how quickly circumstances can shift from ordinary to extraordinary. Hours earlier, Maria and her sister were moving through the countryside, focused on getting her to her new position. Hours later, dusk would settle over the farm, with everyone inside unaware that it was their last evening. The barn and house would appear unchanged from the outside, and there would be no immediate sign to anyone passing by that danger had closed in. In the decades since, this sequence of Maria stepping into the household, the quiet afternoon, and the settling into her room has been seen as the final addition to a pattern that had been building for months. The moment marked the end of any opportunity for the household to prepare or change course. If earlier signs had been the beginning of a threat taking shape, her arrival was the point at which the plan, whatever it was already in place. Whatever happened next was going to happen with her inside the farm. Maria Baumgartner's first day was also her last. In that quiet window between afternoon arrival and nightfall, the unseen danger that had been circling Hinterkaifeck was ready to move. The routine of that day would give way to the violence of the night, and the stillness that followed would only be broken when outsiders finally came days later. For Maria, it was a job that never truly began, and a first night that would be her last. The next moments would bring the first steps of the killer's plan into motion. How did 6 people end up separated and killed in the barn without raising alarm? That question has been at the center of this case for over a century. Investigators who reached Hinterkaifeck found 4 of the 6 victims inside the barn itself, laid together in a way that did not look accidental. The arrangement of those bodies suggested the killer had control over the scene for a significant amount of time, and that there was a clear reason for placing them there. The difficulty for anyone trying to understand what happened is explaining how the killer managed to draw each victim into the barn without the others suspecting something was wrong. The first working theory from investigators was that the killer used the animals to create a reason for someone to check the barn. On an active farm, sounds from the stables could signal a real problem, such as an animal in distress, a broken fence, or a predator nearby. These were situations that demanded a quick response. If someone heard strange noises coming from that direction, the natural reaction would be to walk out and check. That theory, on its surface, could explain why each person left the safety of the house, one at a time. But later, examinations of the property challenged this idea. Evidence suggested that someone inside the house might not have heard cries or struggles from the barn at all. The structure was built with thick wooden walls, and the distance between the living quarters and the stable area was enough to muffle noise, especially if doors were closed. The barn itself was part of a connected arrangement common to Bavarian farms, where the stable stood under a shared roof, but was separate enough that work inside it could go unnoticed by someone in the living areas. The sound insulation from construction and materials meant voices could easily have been contained within the barn, masking any shout or scream that might have given the others time to run. With that understanding, the killer's task may have been simpler. They did not need to eliminate all noise. They only needed to prevent an alarm that carried back into the house. The first victim is believed to have been Andreas Gruber. At around 63 years old, he would have been the one most likely to investigate a disturbance in the stable. Once inside, in the shadowed area near the animals and feed, the killer struck. The weapon was the farm's own mattock, a multi-purpose tool with a long handle and a heavy, sharp-edged head used for breaking up soil and chopping wood. It was the kind of tool anyone on the property could locate quickly. After Andreas, the sequence continued. His wife, Cecilia, likely followed next, drawn either by curiosity over his delay or by the same noise that had brought him in. She, too, was killed in the barn. Victoria, the couple's adult daughter, was the third. She would have been alone in the house with her 2 children when she realized both parents had gone toward the stable but not come back. In a farm family, that kind of unexplained delay could not be ignored. Whether she also heard something from the barn or simply went to find them, her path ended in the same place. The youngest of the 4 found in the barn was also named Cecilia, the 7-year-old granddaughter of Andreas. She may have followed her mother or been called to the barn in some way. The exact order after the first death is based on reconstruction from body positioning and blood patterns, but all 4 were killed without alerting the others inside the living quarters. The first 3 were likely attacked without much chance to defend themselves. Reports later suggested that little Cecilia may have still been alive after the initial blow, injured and unable to escape, left in the barn alongside the others for hours before dying. The way their bodies were treated after death stands out. Rather than leaving them where they fell, the killer placed them together, stacking hay or straw over them. The layering did not look like an attempt at a full burial. It was more of a concealment, enough to cover the scene from casual view. Arranging bodies in this way requires time and a lack of outside threat. Each movement risks noise and delay, but here there was no rush. That detail, as much as the killings themselves, shows the killer had confidence they would not be interrupted. The choice of weapon and the setting also suggest a degree of planning. A mattock in a barn is easy to reach and quiet to use compared to firearms. Someone familiar with farm routines would know where to find it and how to handle it. They would also understand how to use the barn's interior to control visibility. Once a victim stepped inside and moved far enough from the door, the path back was cut off. Aggressive action could be taken without witnesses on the outside. Investigators considering these facts pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. The person committing the murders knew the farm well enough to predict movements, anticipate reactions, and use the property's layout for their own advantage. This was not the work of someone wandering into the area by chance. It required familiarity with the family's habits and the confidence that each victim could be approached separately without causing an immediate alarm. The barn's position, partly shielded from the main house, and the muted sound between them, worked in the killer's favor. By the time all four were dead in the barn, the killer had already removed the majority of the household's adult members. That left only the infant Joseph and the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, inside the house. What makes this stage of events so stark is the precision with which it split the group. In a matter of hours, or possibly less, every person who could resist or raise an alarm was taken out of the equation. Each was drawn to the same location, under circumstances they were trained by life on a farm to see as routine. The conflicting evidence about sound from the barn remains one of the points that makes the reconstruction uncertain. If screams could not be heard, the killer's job was easier. If they could have been heard but were not, it raises questions about timing and about what the two people left in the house were doing during those moments. Some reconstructions propose that the murders in the barn happened very quickly, with each victim dying almost immediately after entering, giving the others little or no time to respond before it was their turn to be lured in. The care taken to conceal the four bodies suggests the killer was thinking about what might happen if someone arrived unexpectedly in the yard. A visitor might notice the absence of the family from the house, but stacked and covered in the barn, the dead would not be immediately visible. That act also removed visual and physical evidence from where it was created, making it slightly harder for anyone later to reconstruct the exact sequence. What it did not change was the overall impression. Whoever did this was in full control of the scene and the timing. The barn killings mark the point where the crime shifted from isolated incidents in the previous months to an all-consuming act that left no one on the property safe. They also show that the killer was comfortable spending time in one location with multiple victims present. Each act of violence increased the chance of discovery, yet the killer appears to have worked without visible hurry. That confidence says as much about their understanding of the farm's isolation as it does about their intent. It is in these details, the choice of method, the use of the barn's design, the concealment, that the picture emerges of someone deeply familiar with Hinterkaifeck. They knew how to use the environment to separate and control the victims. They also knew that once the adults were gone, the final killings could happen without any risk of serious resistance. When the work in the barn was done, 4 bodies lay together under hay. The farm's strongest and most capable defenders were gone. Only those inside the living quarters remained. The killer's next steps would take them into the house itself, where the last of the family and the newcomer who had arrived only that afternoon were still unaware of what had already happened just outside their door. After the barn killings, the killer was not finished. The 4 bodies lay concealed under hay, but inside the house 2 more lived, and, at that moment, had no reason to believe anything had changed. The distance and design between the living quarters and the barn meant that silence there did not mean safety. The killer now turned toward removing anyone left who could later tell what they had seen. The first of the remaining victims was 2-year-old Joseph. He was Victoria's younger child, still an infant in most ways. At the time of the murders, he was resting in his bassinet, in a room inside the main house. A bassinet kept him low to the floor, surrounded by blankets or cloth, in an environment where nothing around him would have hinted at violence, only a short distance away. The killer's entry into this space would not have been contested. There were no defensive wounds on his body. That absence speaks to the speed and certainty of the attack. A single blow with the same mattock used in the barn ended his life before he could cry out. Maria Baumgartner was in her own upstairs room. She had arrived that very afternoon, gone through the process of meeting the family, settling her belongings, and being shown the spaces where she would work and sleep. After the barn killings, she was likely unaware of any disturbance. Without knowing about the unfolding events, there was no reason for her to bar her door or take up anything for protection. She was found in her bed, still in sleeping clothes, with no evidence that she had fought back. This lack of struggle is consistent with the conclusion that she was attacked, either while resting or in the first moments after seeing the killer enter her room. The use of the same weapon ties the deaths inside the house directly to those in the barn. A mattock taken from the property is easy to carry between the two areas and requires no special preparation. This choice of weapon is practical for someone already familiar with farming tools, and in this case, it was also consistent across all 6 killings, leaving no doubt that a single person could have managed the sequence without switching instruments. For investigators, the detail that there were no defensive wounds on Maria or Josef narrowed the possibilities for how the attacks in the house occurred. A fight leaves marks not only on the victim, but often on the attacker. Here, the pattern was different. Both killings appear to have been fast, targeted strikes made without warning. It shows the continuation of a method seen in the barn, approaching the victim from a position of advantage and not allowing time for them to react. One of the most disturbing findings after the murders was that little Cecilia, the 7-year-old granddaughter, may have still been alive after her attack in the barn. Reports from the investigation record that she lay among the straw for several hours before dying, during which she tore out tufts of her own hair. This detail suggests both the severity of her head injury and the prolonged suffering she endured. It also means that while the killer was moving from the barn to the house to kill Josef and Maria, one of the earlier victims was not yet dead. The calculated nature of proceeding with additional murders, knowing someone was still wounded in the other building, is part of what marks this crime as chilling in its control. This stage of the killings added 2 more bodies to the total and removed the last living witnesses other than the killer. The fact that these attacks were carried out without hesitation after the earlier violence reflects the same level of calm seen in the barn. There was no apparent rush, no evidence that the killer feared discovery in the moments between these acts. Even after 6 people were dead or dying, the crime scene showed signs that the perpetrator had the freedom to move at will between buildings. The locations of Josef and Maria's bodies also suggested that the killer knew the layout of the home. There was no searching recorded in the scene that would indicate confusion over where people might be sleeping. Moving quickly to exactly where each target lay points to prior knowledge, either from visits to the farm in the past or from observing the household before the crime. For Maria, who had been there only hours, being struck while in bed underscores that her role in this was only to be counted among the occupants. There is no evidence that she was a specific target for any reason beyond being present. The quick dispatch of the final 2 victims also meant there was little to alter or clean in the home before the killer could do whatever came next. The barn scene, with 4 people hidden under straw, and the interior scene, with both remaining victims left where they fell, showed consistency in how the bodies were treated after death. There was covering in one location, none in the other, but in both cases there was no panic evident in those arrangements. For modern readers, it is hard to separate the killings from the knowledge that they were followed by an extended period in which the killer stayed on the property. But in the sequence of events as they happened, the move from the barn to the house is a clear inflection point. Up to then, there was still the possibility that someone inside could have been warned or escaped. Once Maria and Josef were dead, that possibility was gone. The nature of the attacks inside the house aligns with a methodical approach. There was no wasted movement, no change in weapon, and no sign of hesitation. That level of control over a scene with multiple victims, spread across 2 separate interiors, remains one of the reasons investigators at the time, and later, have pointed toward a person comfortable within that space. It is not only the violence that leaves an impression, but also the composure with which the violence was delivered. Maria's first and only night at Hinterkaifeck ended without her ever knowing the history of the strange events in the months before. Josef's brief life ended in the setting meant to be safest for a child, quiet, indoors, with family nearby. In both cases, those protective conditions meant nothing against an attacker who had already removed every possible source of defense. The absence of defensive wounds is more than a forensic detail. It illustrates the imbalance of power in those final moments, and the choice to execute the killings in a way that eliminated even the chance of calling out. The image of the wounded Cecilia in the barn, still alive as her younger brother and the new maid were killed elsewhere, adds to the weight of those hours. It shows not just an act of violence against each victim, but a sequence that allowed suffering to continue while the killer carried on. That absence of interruption, coupled with the deliberate completion of the killings, suggests an attacker who was willing to prolong the events rather than be satisfied with fewer deaths. By the time the final 2 in the house were dead, the total stood at 6. There were no animals harmed, no signs of ransacking in search of valuables, no immediate departure. The killings completed the removal of every human on the property except the one who had done it. What happened in the hours and days after would reveal that the crime did not conclude here. Instead of leaving, the murderer stayed, moving freely between the same rooms that had just seen the attacks. Later discovery would show that fires were lit, food was eaten, and animals were cared for as if the farmhouse was still occupied in the normal way. But at this point in the timeline, Maria in her bed and Joseph in his bassinet were the last in a chain of swift, controlled killings that ended any possibility of resistance. Instead of leaving after the murders, the killer stayed at Hinterkaifeck. For roughly 3 days, they lived in the same farmhouse where 6 people now lay dead. The details of what was done during that time make the case even more unsettling. Food from the kitchen was eaten, the entire supply of bread finished. Fires were lit, sending smoke up from the chimney for anyone passing to see. And in the barn, cattle were fed and watered as usual. Someone not only stayed, but kept the visible parts of farm life going. Police later noted these details in their reports. The family's meals had been drawn from loaves of bread gone and basic staples reduced. Fires were not an accident or leftover embers. They were deliberately made. This meant whoever stayed there used the rooms not as a hiding place, but as a home. Tending livestock was another deliberate choice. It kept the animals alive and quiet, which also gave the appearance that the household was running normally. For someone familiar with farming, that would also mean avoiding the added noise or distress that could bring unwanted attention. In the days right after the killings, there were visitors to the property. A coffee seller, a repairman, and others came by for routine reasons. The farm had a reputation for privacy, so finding the door unanswered was not enough to raise alarm. Seeing smoke from the chimney was another reason to think everything was fine. Smoke meant heat, meant someone was moving around inside. Coupled with animals still being cared for, it gave no outward signal of what lay inside the barn and house. This ability to blend normal tasks into a cover for homicide points toward deep familiarity with the victim's routines. Feeding cattle is not something a random intruder is likely to attempt for days unless they know how to do it. Handling large animals requires skill and comfort, especially in an unfamiliar place. The killer not only had the willingness to do it, but seems to have anticipated that keeping the animals alive would ensure the scene outside looked undisturbed. The bread and simple food supplies were likely chosen because they were easy to prepare without much disruption. It is also worth noting what staying actually meant in this context. The killer was living among the evidence. Every room still held what had happened. In most murder cases, police see offenders flee quickly, worrying that someone will discover them or that the authorities will arrive. Here, the person responsible made the opposite calculation. They believed they could stay without being caught, long enough to eat, sleep, and maintain the farm's appearance. It shows a high degree of control over their own emotions. From a psychological view, staying could signal several things. It can suggest a lack of urgency, believing discovery was unlikely in the short term. It might indicate they wanted to remove or alter evidence. The longer the scene went untouched by outsiders, the more chance there was to change small details, take away items, or shift things out of sight. It could also mean the killer wanted to occupy the victim's space, an act seen in some crimes where control over both person and place is part of the motive. Whatever the reason, the decision to remain had consequences for the investigation. Any evidence that could have been preserved in its original state was being handled or moved for days before authorities saw it. Footprints, tool positions, and even traces of the killer's own presence during the murders could have been altered or destroyed in this post-crime period. And because neighbors did not suspect a problem, no one came to check closely enough to interrupt. The location worked in the killer's favor. Haar, the nearest small community, knew the Grubers as self-contained. In towns like that in 1922, it was not unexpected for a family to go about their work without seeing others for days. Some farms could go nearly a week without visits, especially between market days. Mail carriers came on schedule, but unless they were due, the gap between interactions gave cover for someone wanting to stay unseen. Even when people passed near the farmhouse, they did not see anything that pointed to trouble. The chimney smoke was a key part of this deception. It gave off the impression that fires were being lit for normal household use, cooking, warmth, drying clothes. The reality that the fire was being used by the killer was hidden. Feeding animals is another detail that would matter to anyone passing by. Livestock in distress can be noisy. A barn of unfed cattle makes a noticeable sound, and neighbors might follow that noise to offer help. Keeping them content eliminated that risk. The fact that the animals survived those days is a detail worth dwelling on. It shows the killer was willing to put in the time and effort to keep them alive, which suggests not just familiarity with farm operation, but possibly some attachment to keeping the property in order. This was not someone tearing the place apart in a rushed search. It was not looted. Most of the household's valuable items were left untouched. The use of resources seemed centered on sustaining the killer's stay rather than taking goods away. From the perspective of those who later tried to reconstruct the timeline, these choices point away from panic and toward planning. A person who decides to stay for multiple nights must be confident in several factors: that no one will check in immediately, that they can meet their own needs there, and that they know enough about the space to move around without drawing attention. All three appear to have been true in this case. It is also worth considering what the killer's daily existence might have looked like in those 3 days. Meals prepared simply from what was at hand, tending to animals in the relative safety of the barn, spending time in the rooms of the house, perhaps even sleeping in the victims' beds, all while knowing that under the straw in the barn and in an upstairs room, the bodies of those who lived there remained. This scenario adds to the sense of calculation. It was not simply about hiding. It was about functioning within the space as though nothing had happened. The killer's choice to keep using the house, rather than abandoning it, meant that they shared the same walls, the same air, with the results of what they had done. That kind of presence over days suggests a threshold of detachment most people cannot reach. They did not leave when they could have. They did not destroy property. They did not leave animals to starve or fields to stand untended. In the outward details, they kept things in order. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that small changes were made that will never be known. Items might have been moved, documents or tools handled, and subtle traces wiped away. The idea that anything from those days could have been staged is part of why the case remains so debated. Without a prompt discovery, the scene the police walked into was already altered from the one that existed on the night of March 31st. In other cases where killers remain at a scene, it is usually for hours, not days. The rarity of a 3-day stay marks Hinterkaifeck as especially unusual. Investigators saw it as an action that moved beyond survival or immediate escape. Whether it was to cover tracks, to mislead, or simply because they felt safe, the choice to remain is one of the most disturbing features of the case. Neighbors who later tried to piece together their memories recalled seeing smoke, but thinking little of it. In the absence of direct contact, life at the farm appeared unchanged from a distance. Without an obvious break in rhythms, there was nothing to make them interrupt their own routines to check inside. That visual reassurance is likely exactly what allowed the killer to finish their time there without incident. This was the part of the crime that extended the danger past the violence. For those 3 days, the person responsible lived freely on the property. They were there when visitors came to the yard and left again, none the wiser. They were there each morning when the animals were let out and fed. The attack itself was fatal to 6 people, but the presence afterward shows an added dimension. Confidence that the murderer had the time and conditions to remain in place. It was only when the farm's unusual quiet finally outlasted even the Gruber's private habits that anyone thought to press closer. The silence that followed years of isolation was, in the end, what forced others to step through the doors and see what had happened inside. Days passed before anyone stepped inside to find out what had happened at Hinterkaifeck. In that time, the farm looked, from a distance, like it was going on as usual. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney. The cattle were fed. Nothing on the outside suggested 6 people inside the property were no longer alive. On April 1st, the day after the murders, 2 coffee sellers, Hans Shirovsky and Eduard Shirovsky, made their way to the farm. They came to take an order as they had before. When they reached the yard, they noticed the gate to the machine house stood open. No one came to meet them. They waited for a while, calling out, but there was no answer. They decided to leave, assuming the family was away for some reason. At that point, there was no thought that danger might be involved. People in the area were used to the Grubers keeping to themselves. 3 more days went by. On April 4th, local mechanic Albert Hoffner came to repair an engine in one of the outbuildings. He found the same silence. For him, the only signs of life came from the animals and the dog in the barn. He waited for about an hour before starting his work. The repair took more than 4 hours. During that time, no one came out of the house, and no one spoke from inside. Despite the length of his visit, he left at the end without going into the living quarters or the barn. That absence of curiosity or alarm reflected how easily isolation could mask trouble. While these visits came and went without changing anything, people nearby began to notice smaller signs that something might be wrong. The absence of 7-year-old Cecilia from school was one of them. The family also failed to appear at Sunday worship. These gaps stood out because, for all their privacy, the Grubers rarely missed such fixtures in the weekly routine. These details reached Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who knew the family. On April 4th, Schlittenbauer decided to send his 16-year-old son Johann and his 9-year-old stepson Josef to the farm to see if they could find anyone there. When the boys returned without a clear answer, he gathered 2 other men, Michael Pearl and Jakob Sigel. The 3 set out together to the property that afternoon. It was around 3:30 p.m. when they reached Hinterkaifeck. They headed first toward the barn. The building was large, connected to the living quarters, but distinct enough to be entered separately. Inside, the light was dim except where openings let it in. As they moved toward the area where hay was kept, they found an uneven stack that looked out of place. When they shifted the covering, they exposed the bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, and the younger Cecilia. The 4 were lying close together. Each showed wounds to the head. The way they were covered made it clear someone had taken deliberate steps to conceal them. For Schlittenbauer and the others, the scene removed any doubt that foul play had taken place. From there, they went into the house. Inside one of the bedrooms, they found 2-year-old Joseph in his bassinet. He was dead, killed in the same way as the others. Upstairs, in a room set apart for the help, they found Maria Baumgartner. She was still in bed, dressed for sleeping. The position of her body and the nature of her wounds suggested a quick, fatal strike while she was resting. At that point, all 6 of the household's occupants had been found, 4 in the barn, 1 in a bedroom on the main floor, and 1 upstairs. News of the discovery travelled quickly through the surrounding area, drawing more people to the farm. That influx, while a natural reaction, had serious consequences for the investigation. Neighbours, villagers, and those simply curious came into the buildings. Some moved bodies to see them better, adjusted objects, and even prepared food in the kitchen. Each action disturbed the crime scene further. Police who arrived soon after were faced with locations already altered from how the killer had left them. In modern terms, much of the physical evidence was compromised before it could be studied. Traces that might have shown a sequence of movement, the exact position of objects, or the identity of the killer were handled, shifted, or worn away. Even with this, investigators began their work, examining the state of the bodies, the tool used, and the arrangement of the barn. The order in which the bodies were discovered also fixed the image of the crime in the public memory. The barn contained the family's 3 adults working the land and the school-aged child, while the house held the infant and the maid. That arrangement matched what investigators believed had occurred. The killer dealt with the adults and older child first, using a reason to draw them into the barn one by one before moving to the house to kill the remaining 2. For those familiar with farming, the barn naturally drew attention when something was wrong. It was the place where animals could be in distress or where tools needed for a task might be fetched. The delayed discovery meant the killer's time on the farm between March 31st and April 4th had gone entirely uninterrupted. During that period, they were able to eat, rest, and tend the animals without interference. The idea that these normal-seeming signs, smoke in the chimney, well-fed cattle, were masking a multiple homicide added to the case's notoriety from the start. The very habits that reassured visitors allowed the killer to avoid suspicion long enough to leave on their own terms. In the days after, the court physician Johann Baptist Ohlmüller performed the autopsies. They were done in the barn itself, one day after the discovery. Moving bodies through that space again, with many people still coming and going, further disturbed what might have been left to study. It reflected the limits of resources and practices in rural Bavaria at the time, where examinations were often done on site rather than transported elsewhere. The discovery also forced those who knew the family to reconsider the events of the months before. Now, the unexplained newspaper, the footprints without a return trail, the broken lock, and the maid's sudden departure sat in a line that pointed towards something building toward violence. Neighbours who had offered to help guard the property could see how refusing had sealed the isolation. The meetings with no answer in the days after the murders became, in hindsight, moments when the killer was likely only yards away, maintaining the illusion of an occupied, functioning farm. For the men who first walked into the barn, the memory was lasting. Their entry ended a period in which a killer had sole use of the property and began the official handling of the crime. But by then, the damage to the investigation's clarity was already done. The earliest signs that could have been collected, the order of footprints in the yard, the freshness of hay or feed, the specific placement of tools, were lost beneath the changes made in those first reactions by townspeople. Even with that, the discoveries laid out the full cost of what had happened. 6 people dead, each killed on their own land, most of them separated from each other in their last moments. The barn, which had been a place of work and routine, now held the majority of the family. The home, meant to be a place of rest, had been the scene of the final attacks. Together, they formed a crime scene that did not match any simple break-in or robbery, but something that required knowledge of the family's patterns and movements. The moment Lorenz Schlittenbauer and his companions moved the hay in the barn was the point where the hidden reality of Hinterkaifeck became visible. Everything else, from the visitors walking away days earlier to the work done by the mechanic, had existed inside the larger illusion that the farm was going on as usual. Once broken, that illusion cast all the earlier events in a different light. From there, the investigation would have to work backward, from a compromised scene, through the thin timeline of visitors and sightings, to a chain of unsettling incidents in the months before. What stood out most was that the threat had been present on the property for days, without any of the usual signals of danger. It meant that the real danger at Hinterkaifeck had not only arrived quietly, it had been given the time and space to stay until it chose to leave. Welcome back again. As usual, please comment down below what time it is wherever you are right now, and like the video. Let's get to it. Imagine buying a bottle of Tylenol from your local pharmacy, something sitting on shelves in every American household. Now imagine that same bottle quietly contains cyanide strong enough to kill you almost instantly. In 1982, this nightmare was real. Ordinary people trusted an everyday painkiller, but within days, Chicago was in chaos. Hospitals were on high alert, and detectives were scrambling to solve a case that seemed impossible. A 12-year-old girl woke up with what seemed like nothing more than a minor cold. Her nose was runny, she felt sluggish, and it was the kind of complaint every parent has heard countless times before school. Her parents, wanting to ease her discomfort, reached for a small bottle in the medicine cabinet. It was extra-strength Tylenol, a trusted household remedy that had become as normal as a loaf of bread sitting on the counter. They poured out a capsule, handed it to her with a glass of water, and thought nothing more of it. That morning seemed no different from any other, but within hours their daughter was gone. Mary Kellerman's collapse was sudden and terrifying. She had taken the capsule, got ready for her day, and soon after began complaining of feeling faint. The change happened so quickly that her parents could barely react. One moment she was walking and talking, the next she fell, collapsing to the floor with no warning. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors were left baffled. Here was a perfectly healthy young girl who, only minutes earlier, had shown few symptoms beyond ordinary cold-like complaints. Now she was in critical condition with no immediate explanation. Time in the emergency room moved with urgency but also confusion. Medical staff checked her vital signs, ran tests, and moved quickly, but nothing added up. Mary was young, active, and had no significant medical history that could explain this sudden event. By sunrise, she was gone. What made it even more disturbing was that no one could identify a clear cause. To all appearances, the situation was entirely inexplicable. An apparently random death in a child who had no prior health concerns. Doctors at the hospital struggled to piece together her final moments. They searched for underlying conditions, infections, or hidden weaknesses in her body that could have caused the sudden failure. Every possible medical explanation felt hollow, because the speed at which she declined was unlike anything typical. Cyanide poisoning, which would later be uncovered as the culprit, works precisely in this way. Once consumed, cyanide enters the bloodstream and cuts off the body's ability to use oxygen. Organs begin shutting down in a matter of minutes, causing dizziness, convulsions, and eventually death. The sequence is mercilessly fast. But on that morning, no one had such a possibility in mind, let alone linked it to something as common as Tylenol. The idea that a single over-the-counter medicine could hold such danger was unthinkable. Tylenol was seen as gentle, safe even for children, and dependable for common headaches, fevers, or minor discomforts. It had become part of the rhythm of American households. Just as families stocked bread, milk, and coffee, those red and white bottles quietly claimed a permanent place in bathrooms and kitchens. No one questioned it. Taking a capsule was about as ordinary an act as pouring cereal into a bowl, a daily ritual that carried no sense of risk or concern. That morning in the Kellerman household represents something more than just a tragic loss. It reveals how deeply people trusted Tylenol, and by extension, how vulnerable they were. The death of Mary set off confusion not only for her family but also for the doctors who tried to save her. They were left unsure where to even begin looking for answers. The swiftness of the poisoning meant there were no clear signs, no warning symptoms that gave anyone time to react. This uncertainty built a quiet dread, because the cause did not fit into any established medical category. Her parents had simply done what millions of parents across the country would have done in the same situation: reached for the most common and trusted medicine available. That act, so routine that it required almost no thought, instead triggered the end of a young girl's life. In many ways, it was the ordinariness of the act that made what followed even more chilling. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing stood out, until suddenly everything changed, and yet at the time, it would have been impossible to imagine how this tragedy linked to something larger. Doctors treated it as an unusual, isolated case, and the family was left with devastating loss and no answers. The community had no reason to suspect that danger was sitting on store shelves across the city. No police warnings were issued, and no announcements were made. At this stage, the puzzle of Mary's death was confined to hospital records and family grief. The power of cyanide lies not only in how lethal it is, but also in how unnoticeable it becomes in daily life. It has no distinct taste in small amounts, and the signs of poisoning erupt so quickly that people often confuse the onset with fainting or other harmless conditions until it is too late. Few, if any, people at the time had reason to think about such poisons in connection with everyday medicine. Tampering with sealed products was not part of the public consciousness, and protective packaging was minimal to non-existent. Trust in products remained high, and corporations enjoyed that trust without public suspicion of contamination or tampering. What Mary's story showed, though, was that beneath that trust lay an unseen risk. She had taken a drug that symbolized health and safety, and within minutes it became the source of something lethal. Through no fault of her own, through no error on her parents' part, her life ended because of an act carried out far away, before the medicine ever reached her household. That disconnect between the ordinary decision of a family and the horror concealed in a capsule is what made the situation so haunting and powerful. At the time of her death, no one could predict that she was not the only one. No one could know that this moment was not an isolated tragedy, but the first sign of a sequence about to shake an entire city. Other families were about to find themselves staring at the same incomprehensible collapse in their loved ones. Other parents, siblings, and spouses would soon watch a healthy person swallow a capsule and fall within minutes. Mary's case was only the beginning. Before long, households across Chicago, with no connection to one another, would be tied together by the same invisible hand. Each case would look separate, random, and sudden at first glance. Within days, though, the connection among them would become unmistakable, and the horror of what was really happening would begin to surface. How did the most trusted name in medicine become the killer's perfect weapon? To understand how Tylenol capsules turned into instruments of death, we first need to look at the reputation the brand held at the time. In the early 1980s, Tylenol was not just another pain reliever found on the drugstore shelf. It was the leading product in the United States for over-the-counter relief from headaches, fever, and everyday aches. More than 1 in 3 households kept a bottle nearby. Parents gave it to their children without hesitation. Doctors recommended it as an alternative to aspirin, which had raised concerns over stomach irritation and a possible link to a rare syndrome. By 1982, Tylenol was not simply competing, it was dominating. This dominance came from the way Americans saw it. Tylenol was marketed as safe, reliable, and family-friendly. It was seen as a medicine with no edge, no sharp undertones, nothing controversial. Aspirin had its risks. Other brands did not have the same standing. Tylenol, however, had become a trusted companion for families across all walks of life. A bottle sat quietly in bathrooms, kitchens, handbags, and cars. The red and white label was instantly recognizable, and the brand became synonymous with everyday care. In essence, it was the soft, reliable backdrop of American health culture, but what gave Tylenol its edge in popularity also gave the murderer unique access. At the time, the product often came in capsule form. Capsules were admired for how easy they were to swallow and how quickly they dissolved once taken. They were introduced as a consumer-friendly alternative to chalky tablets. The convenience, though, came at a price. Unlike pressed tablets, capsules came in 2 pieces that could be easily pulled apart. Medicine could be poured out and substituted with other substances, then rejoined without much visible difference. For anyone intent on tampering, capsules were fragile, exposed, and simple to manipulate. That weakness would not have mattered in a world where no one imagined tampering was even possible. In 1982, Americans had little reason to distrust the safety of packaged goods. Grocery shelves held products in boxes or bottles that could be opened and closed without obvious detection. Foil seals, shrink-wrapped lids, and childproofing were not yet standard. A jar of peanut butter, a bottle of aspirin, or a container of vitamins could be opened at the store and replaced without anyone knowing. The idea of someone deliberately poisoning a random bottle of pills from a store shelf felt distant, almost unthinkable. Convenience was valued far more than security. For Johnson & Johnson, Tylenol's parent company, capsules were part of a strategy to make medicine frictionless for the consumer. If people could take pills more comfortably, they would take them more often. and the company's approach worked. By the dawn of the 1980s, extra-strength Tylenol had become the #1 over-the-counter medicine in the United States. In some markets, it outpaced all competitors combined. This meant that the product was everywhere, at checkout aisles, in corner pharmacies, and on shelves inside gas stations. For families, no trip to town was complete without passing a dozen places that sold Tylenol. This wide availability, coupled with overwhelming trust, created the perfect environment for someone willing to sabotage that trust. The contrast lies here. The brand most strongly associated with safety held a design most open to interference. Capsules were meant to show how modern and advanced the product was, yet their construction opened the very door the killer would use. The vulnerability was subtle enough that it escaped ordinary thought. Very few people in 1982 understood how easy it was to manipulate a capsule. Those who bought Tylenol focused on relief from headaches and colds, not on imagining invisible dangers hiding in the capsule's casing. To them, those bottles seemed as sealed and certain as bread loaves or milk cartons, and in the absence of suspicion, no one checked. If the bottle looked closed, then it must be safe. This widespread lack of suspicion created an enormous gap between how much consumers trusted the brand and how little security the product's design truly offered. That gap was invisible until the first deaths were reported. Only then did families, doctors, and officials realize how easily the medicine could be turned into a weapon, and because Tylenol was woven so deeply into everyday life, the attack was not limited to one household or one unlucky individual. Wherever the capsules were sold, the possibility of tampering existed. The crime was not confined to a single neighborhood or pharmacy, but floated in the uncertainty of a product everyone had in their homes. In a chilling way, it was Tylenol's popularity that gave the killer reach. A random act of sabotage might have gone unnoticed if it targeted a brand few cared about. But Tylenol's dominance meant every tampered capsule had a ready victim waiting. Any person who bought medicine from a shelf in Chicago during those days risked exposure. Each ordinary headache or stomachache provided the killer another opportunity. Tampering with Tylenol gave the perpetrator access to countless people without ever leaving a trace of connection between them. That reach also magnified the fear. Once word of the poisoning spread, the effect was not just grief among the families who had lost loved ones, but terror across an entire city. Every medicine cabinet, every bathroom shelf suddenly looked unsafe. Families questioned the same bottles they had casually trusted for years. The killer had not chosen a rare or obscure target. They had hijacked the nation's #1 painkiller, the very thing people associated with reliability. By doing so, they turned trust itself into a danger. When viewed in this context, the murders became not only an act of violence, but a case study in how much people relied on perception. Packaging looked unchanged, the capsules appeared intact, the brand name was one everyone knew, and under those layers of familiarity and comfort, cyanide sat waiting. Safety and danger had never been so close. In the weeks after, prosecutors and investigators struggled to explain how vulnerability in such a trusted product could exist without anyone realizing it. Yet the product's widespread use, the very thing that had made Tylenol America's leading household medicine, also made it the perfect vessel for mass fear and indiscriminate harm. A single capsule on a single morning might have appeared as an accident, but as the deaths multiplied across different families and neighborhoods, the true connection became unavoidable. That connection tied together the otherwise random tragedies, pointing to one unmistakable link. Each victim had taken extra-strength Tylenol just before their collapse. Suddenly, what seemed like separate medical mysteries and private losses formed a chain, and as that chain became clearer, the investigation shifted its focus away from isolated events and toward the reality that someone had turned America's most trusted brand of medicine into a weapon. Within just a few days, 7 different people in the Chicago area were gone. At first glance, their death seemed unrelated. They did not live on the same block, they did not work in the same building, and they did not share the same backgrounds. A flight attendant collapsed in her suburban home. A young postal worker never made it through his shift. A homemaker preparing for her day suddenly turned pale and stopped breathing. Different lives, different circumstances, but all of them ended within minutes of what had seemed like an ordinary morning or evening. To their families, the losses were almost impossible to process. These were not people with long records of illness. They were not elderly patients struggling at the edge of endurance. They were ordinary and, for the most part, healthy. The suddenness made the grief even sharper. A parent gone before breakfast, a sibling who had been laughing the night before suddenly silent. For every family, the final moments were marked by confusion. Collapse, a frantic rush for help, and then answers that made no sense. Hospitals and paramedics were left puzzled as to what had struck down people so quickly. Medical staff treating these cases often believed they were seeing heart problems, strokes, or perhaps undiagnosed conditions that surprised everyone. The settings were ordinary, and nothing pointed to foul play. One woman fell after helping her child get ready for school. A man left work early because he felt faint and died hours later. The outward appearance made each case look like a personal, private tragedy. Police were notified, examinations took place, but in those first hours no one drew a line between the families involved. The city was large, people died suddenly every day, and connections across neighborhoods rarely materialized. The exception came in a way that stunned everyone. It was the loss experienced by the Janus family. In the quiet suburb of Arlington Heights, 27-year-old Adam Janus woke up on September 29th feeling mild chest tightness. He took extra-strength Tylenol to ease it. Later that day, he was pronounced dead. His family was in shock. Relatives gathered at his home after learning of his passing, grieving together while still taking in what had just occurred. Later that evening, his younger brother Stanley came to the same house with his wife, Teresa. Stricken with headaches from the emotional weight of the day, they also reached for a bottle of Tylenol. Both complained almost instantly of not feeling right. Both collapsed. Both were gone soon after. 3 lives lost in one family in less than a full day. The devastation rippled far beyond one household. Relatives who had arrived only to comfort Adam's family suddenly found themselves facing a second and third wave of loss. First responders and doctors who handled the cases could not recall another time when tragedy struck the same family in that sequence. The situation was so abnormal that investigators began to consider possibilities they usually would not. It was in this moment that alarm bells sounded louder. Still, even before tying these events together, the communities where each victim lived were already shaken. A mother in Elk Grove Village, who thought she was managing a routine cold, was suddenly gone. A young flight attendant with a long career ahead of her also collapsed after reaching for Tylenol. These victims were linked only by the fact that they lived in the same metropolitan region. Their ages, their jobs, their family situations varied widely. No shared workplace, no shared circle, and no obvious reason to connect one death to another. That randomness is part of what terrified the city. As the stories spread through neighborhoods, the sense of confusion turned to fear. There was no crime scene that neighbors could avoid. There was no dangerous street people were warned not to enter. Instead, it looked like bad luck, striking healthy individuals at random. A teacher, a homemaker, a postal worker, a flight attendant, people that represented everyday Chicagoans in 1982. Their deaths carried no pattern recognizable to the public other than shock and disbelief. Word circulated quickly, and residents began to wonder if they or someone they loved could be next without warning. The police began hearing from different towns and suburbs about sudden deaths that did not fit simple explanations. At first, it was natural to think they were dealing with individual incidents, but with every body examined, every family questioned, paths started to cross. Investigators compared notes on cases where victims all showed the same rapid collapse. Information sharing revealed a chilling link, and when households like the Janus family showed multiple deaths in direct succession, the evidence started pointing towards something shared. The ordinary image of Tylenol bottles sitting on bathroom counters began to come up again and again. Family members noted that the victims had reached for capsules shortly before, showing signs of distress. That detail repeated itself across households. The product quickly stopped being background noise in the stories and became the clear thread. In one case after another, the red and white label sat quietly nearby at the time death struck. To doctors, the repetition was enough to suspect a common source. To the police, it marked a shift in how they viewed the sudden tragedies. They were not looking at separate medical misfortunes in random families anymore. They were now seeing the outlines of something coordinated, something deliberate. Within 3 days, 7 deaths in different corners of Chicago were attached to bottles of extra-strength Tylenol. The same brand, the same form, capsules rather than tablets, the same timing of use just before collapse. The realization spread quickly to the wider community. Newspapers and television began reporting the strange coincidence of multiple deaths tied to a trusted over-the-counter medicine. Fear expanded not only among those who had already purchased Tylenol, but among anyone who recognized how common the product was in their homes. Every consumer ran the same calculation. If it could happen to households that seemed so ordinary, what about theirs? The answer remained unclear, and with no suspect identified, fear filled that space. 7 bodies in 3 days, each pointing to medicine cabinets and store shelves rather than back alleys or known criminals. The only link among them was a name familiar to practically every home in the country. Extra-strength Tylenol, the product most workers, parents, and children had trusted at some point, now stood at the center of sudden, inexplicable death. What looked like separate private tragedies became, in a matter of days, a public emergency with one product connecting them all. The investigation was no longer a matter of grieving families in silence. It was now a matter of science and proof. The task was to identify what lay inside those capsules that could kill so many so fast, and to understand whether this was an accident, contamination, or something darker. For police and doctors, the days ahead would focus on studying the contents of those bottles, searching for the answer to how a trusted household remedy had become the common link between 7 lives cut short. Word of mouth, neighborhood rumors, and news reports raised fear to an almost tangible level. In homes across Chicago, people looked inside their cupboard at familiar red and white labels with hesitation. The same medicine that had been so ordinary a week earlier suddenly looked sinister. And with no one caught, that suspicion was left hanging over an entire city. Each untimely death pointed to Tylenol, but the true cause still had to be confirmed. For investigators, that meant turning to the labs, examining the capsules, and preparing to face the disturbing results that came next. What invisible killer could drop healthy people to the floor within minutes? That question weighed heavily on investigators as more deaths piled up across Chicago. In the beginning, medical examiners were not sure what they were dealing with. One case involved a child, another, a young woman in good health. Others were middle-aged adults with no reason to collapse so suddenly. The sequence did not fit any known disease or outbreak. Doctors and pathologists were trained to look for underlying weaknesses, like hidden heart conditions, strokes, or infections. But the cases looked alarmingly different. The victims had gone from sitting or standing upright to hitting the ground in a matter of minutes. The rapid decline left almost no window for medical treatment, no chance for hospitals to buy more time. That suddenness pointed away from natural causes and toward something poisonous. During testing, an unusual detail emerged. Technicians working with the Tylenol capsules opened several of them in laboratory settings. Inside, they noticed a faint, almond-like odor. While not always detectable, the smell has long been associated with cyanide compounds. For investigators, this was more than just a passing observation. It was a potentially critical clue linking ordinary-looking medicine to a deadly toxin. Medical examiners had already noted how quickly victims lost consciousness. Cyanide poisoning was known to act in minutes, rather than hours or days. The smell created suspicion that had to be tested further. Toxicologists confirmed those fears. When they examined the contents of the capsules, tests showed potassium cyanide. This chemical is capable of killing within minutes, depending on dosage. Investigators soon realized the amount in a single pill was not trace or accidental. Some capsules contained doses hundreds of times stronger than levels known to be fatal. Even a fraction of what was found could have stopped a person's heart or shut down their breathing. The conclusion was clear. This was never accidental contamination from the factory line or a chemical mix-up. Someone had placed cyanide deliberately inside capsules, meant to relieve headaches and fevers. Cyanide works by cutting off oxygen at the cellular level. The body continues to breathe and pump blood, but cells become starved of oxygen. Organs begin to shut down almost instantly. First comes dizziness and a sudden rush of weakness. Shallow breathing follows, and then seizures or cardiac arrest. Without immediate treatment, the victim cannot survive. Paramedics could be called within minutes of a collapse, but by the time they arrived, the person's organs were often already shutting down beyond repair. This explained why so many victims never made it past emergency rooms, despite being rushed there. They had consumed a poison designed to leave no second chance. For investigators, this discovery reshaped the entire case. They were no longer looking at a tragic sequence of random, unexplained deaths. They were dealing with murder. What shocked them further was the setting in which the poison was delivered. In most homicides, the poisoner has to be close to the victim or have some kind of personal link. Here, there was no connection. Random families across suburbs and neighborhoods had each pulled bottles of Tylenol from different shelves. The cyanide was not inside the original product line. The contamination was not caused by factory conditions. Instead, it had to be introduced at some point after the bottles were distributed to stores. What disturbed the public was how invisible the danger was. When someone opened a Tylenol bottle, there was nothing unusual about the packaging. At the time, protective seals were not standard. Consumers simply twisted the cap and poured out a capsule. There was no warning label to check, no foil or plastic cover to peel off. Once a capsule was tampered with, it looked the same as all the others around it. families had no way of distinguishing a lethal pill from a harmless one. For parents who thought they were doing something safe for their children, the discovery cut deep. The act of relief and comfort had been flipped into an act of harm by a stranger. The realization of deliberate tampering created wide panic. Police and health officials began warning people to stop using Tylenol altogether. Hospitals were alerted to watch for signs of cyanide exposure. Pharmacists were told to pull bottles from shelves. All of it was happening in real time, while families across the city still had bottles within reach at home. For many, the thought that the medicine cabinet could hold a killer made their daily routine feel suddenly dangerous. The simplest choice, swallowing a capsule, now carried the shadow of death. The breakthrough also confirmed for law enforcement that they were chasing a murderer rather than an industrial accident. The person had knowledge of how easy it was to separate capsule halves, dump out the acetaminophen powder, and replace it with cyanide crystals. Once the powdery mixture was returned, the capsules could be placed back into bottles with no obvious trace of tampering. This act did not require high technology or factory equipment. It only required access to cyanide, a steady hand, and a willingness to act without fear of being noticed. The simplicity of the method widened the terror. It meant anyone with the same knowledge could potentially attempt it. This was not the first time cyanide had been used as a killing tool. Its history stretched back to suicides during wars and its notorious place in discussions of chemical weapons. But here it had been placed in bottles that anyone from children to grandparents could pick up at a pharmacy. The randomness of who became a victim was what set these murders apart. It was not about targeting one person. It was about using a product trusted in every home to reach strangers with no pattern or motive that investigators could trace. The cyanide capsules became the defining clue in the case. Without toxicology reports, doctors may have continued searching for strange medical syndromes. Without the almond odor observation, the investigation might have lost precious days. Instead, the results left no doubt. There was a killer at work who knew how to use an invisible substance to turn ordinary medicine into a weapon. The police and federal agents understood at that point that they were not just solving individual deaths. They were trying to stop further ones. Every remaining capsule out in the city was a potential murder waiting to happen. Each unopened bottle sitting in a cabinet might or might not be safe. That was enough to mark the moment as a crisis that moved beyond family grief and into public emergency. With cyanide identified, medical examiners had given law enforcement the piece they needed to label the tragedy as deliberate. Stores that once stocked shelves with Tylenol now pulled boxes down in panic. Police precincts filled evidence lockers with bottles turned in by terrified residents. What began as scattered, unexplained collapses had now crystallized into one conclusion no one wanted to believe. Someone had walked among ordinary shoppers, turned capsules into traps, and returned them for sale. The forensic discovery finally connected the dots, but it also raised more questions. Who had that kind of access to cyanide? How did they choose the stores? How many bottles had already been placed back into circulation? Police were searching for footprints in a storm, but time was working against them. They now knew what substance killed the victims, but the person behind it was still invisible. What hung in the air was fear itself. The bright, familiar label of Tylenol looked no different than it always had, but its contents could no longer be trusted. The science of toxicology had exposed what lay hidden inside, and at the same time it had confirmed the worst possibility. These were not faulty pills. They were weapons carefully disguised as medicine. Cyanide was the key forensic clue that dragged this tragedy from confusion into clarity. And once officials labelled it a poisoning, the stage shifted. The deaths were no longer isolated cases. The entire city became the stage for an urgent manhunt that soon grew into a national emergency. Chicago was at war with its medicine cabinet. News reports told families what seemed impossible, that the most common household pain reliever had turned deadly. The warnings came quickly after the discovery of cyanide inside Tylenol capsules. Within hours of the connection being made public, ordinary people scrambled to check their bottles. Some families threw them straight into the trash. Others drove them to police stations, hoping an officer could confirm whether their medicine was safe. The fear spread faster than officials could keep up with, and for the first time in American history, citizens were urged to avoid an everyday product, not because of a defect, but because someone had deliberately tampered with it. Hospitals around the city began receiving a flood of calls. Parents wanted advice on whether to take children in for testing. Adults who had swallowed Tylenol, even without symptoms, feared they might collapse at any moment. Phone lines stayed jammed, and emergency rooms saw waves of people who felt lightheaded or nauseous, believing they had been poisoned. What often turned out to be nerves still had to be taken seriously, because no one could know which reactions were real and which were panic. Meanwhile, Pharmacists pulled Tylenol bottles off shelves across the region. Store managers worked late into the night to remove products and field questions from frightened customers who lined up demanding answers. For law enforcement and public health officials, the challenge was unlike anything they had faced before. They were used to telling people to avoid a food product because of contamination, or to recall a brand of car because of faulty brakes. They had never stood before cameras warning families not to use a leading medicine trusted by millions. It was a message almost impossible to deliver cleanly. "Do not take Tylenol," officials said. "Dispose of any bottles you own." But beyond that advice, they had little else to offer. No suspect had been named. No explanation could be given for how many bottles might be poisoned or where they might be. The instructions boiled down to avoidance and fear. Store employees described scenes that grew more frantic with each passing hour. Clerks at pharmacies saw customers rushing in, some clutching bottles they had at home, demanding to know if they were safe. Others simply looked for reassurance, asking whether pills inside sealed containers could possibly be trusted. Pharmacists tried to explain that capsules were vulnerable and that officials had told them to pull every bottle, regardless of the lot number or manufacturing plant. For many employees, it was one of the strangest days they had ever worked. Instead of ringing up purchases, they were guarding shelves and locking products in back rooms. Beyond the physical withdrawal of Tylenol from stores, the psychological impact cut more deeply. Families began to question what they could trust in their kitchens and bathrooms. If Tylenol could be poisoned, what about cough syrup, vitamins, over-the-counter cold medicine? Confidence in packaged consumer products faltered almost overnight. People turned bottles in their hands, examined caps more closely, and second-guessed ordinary routines. A product's safety had never been questioned on such a wide scale before, and the idea that poison could be hiding in something as common as pain relief left entire communities unsettled. This loss of trust touched the daily rhythm of life. A mother might think twice about which medicine to give her child. A man who relied on Tylenol for headaches after work now had to set the bottle aside, unsure if it harbored something lethal. It was no longer about just one brand of painkiller. The suspicion spread to everyday items in the medicine cabinet. What if other products were also at risk? Supermarkets became places of quiet tension, with shoppers eyeing packaged goods in a way they never had before. The atmosphere was made even more tense by the time of year. It was late September, just weeks before Halloween. Stories of poisoned Tylenol bottles circulating across Chicago bled into broader fears about candy tampering. Parents had long worried about razor blades hidden in apples or foreign objects in candy bars, but now the idea of poison in something bought off a shelf seemed far more real. The holiday that usually brought joy and excitement suddenly carried a heavier shadow. Families wondered whether it was safe to let children accept candy from neighbors, and some considered cancelling trick-or-treating altogether. The timing amplified the sense that everyday consumer goods could be corrupted without warning. Sales reflected this collapse of confidence. Tylenol, which had held more than 1/3 of the nation's market for painkillers, dropped to barely 7% within weeks. It was one of the sharpest falls in consumer trust in modern history. Pharmacies, grocery stores, and department chains everywhere cleared shelves not just in Chicago but across the country. What began as a local tragedy quickly grew into a national concern. People living hundreds of miles away threw away unopened bottles, convinced that there was no margin for error when a single capsule could kill. The numbers told part of the story, but the mood on the ground told the rest. In Chicago, people looked at one another with unease in checkout lines. Neighbors asked if others had discarded their medicine yet. Rumors of additional poisoned products surfaced almost daily, adding to the panic even when no evidence supported them. Police had to track down false leads while managing public fear. The lack of concrete information about who was behind the poisonings or how many bottles were involved allowed anxiety to grow unchecked. In a sense, the absence of answers was its own form of terror. Chicago became the epicenter of consumer distrust. It was not just another crime scene. It was a citywide test of how modern society relies on packaged goods. For generations, people had accepted store shelves as safe spaces. The Tylenol murders shattered that illusion in a matter of days. Behavior shifted instantly. Some households stopped buying painkillers altogether, relying instead on aspirin from older bottles or moving cautiously with generic store brands. Others kept unopened Tylenol bottles under lock and key, waiting for updates from health officials. Life had been reshaped not by fire or flood, but by suspicion. Even as officials worked to calm the panic, the fact remained: no murderer had been caught, and no one knew how to be certain which bottles contained cyanide. This silence from investigators forced families to adjust on their own. Fear stretched into daily routines, changing behaviors in both subtle and obvious ways. Everything from how people shopped to how they treated mild illnesses was influenced by the events unfolding in Chicago. What stood out most was that the panic was not fleeting. Unlike scares that fade once a threat is contained, this one lingered. Every consumer who picked up medicine from that moment forward carried the possibility that the seal had been broken, that someone out of view had tampered with what should have been safe. In this way, the Tylenol murders altered daily life in Chicago, reshaping how people trusted the items sitting quietly in their homes. And while residents tried to adjust, the company behind Tylenol faced a crisis unlike any in modern corporate history. A crisis that would force them to make decisions in full public view with the survival of their brand on the line. How does a company respond when its most popular product becomes deadly overnight? In the fall of 1982, Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer of Tylenol, was thrown into a crisis that threatened not just its most trusted brand, but the entire corporation. With 7 deaths now linked to extra-strength Tylenol capsules and the public in full panic, leaders inside the company faced a decision with no precedent. If they continued to sell bottles, more people might die, and any reputation the brand still held would be shattered. But if they pulled the product, millions of bottles would have to disappear from store shelves, costing the company an amount that could sink it financially. Inside executive offices, debates quickly took shape. Some argued that only Chicago area products should be removed, since that was the location of the murders. Target the region, they said, and avoid mass disruption across the nation. Others pressed that anything less than a sweeping response would appear careless, especially as the media spread reports by the hour. Johnson & Johnson's leaders were forced to confront not only the financial impact, but also a much larger question. What did responsibility look like when the company's household medicine was killing people? The weight of the matter grew with each news segment and front-page headline. Tylenol was no longer seen as the fix for headaches. It was being called the center of death and fear in Chicago. Television cameras showed police officers collecting bottles as if they were evidence in a crime. Families gave interviews explaining how their loved ones had taken capsules one moment and collapsed the next. Every day, the company remained silent or undecided, only deepened suspicion about their priorities. Would they defend profits over people? The company's leadership, headed by Chairman James Burke, decided that the only move was the boldest one. In early October, barely a week after the first victim, Johnson & Johnson ordered a nationwide recall of Tylenol. This meant 31 million bottles were pulled from shelves across the United States. The market value of that recall exceeded $100 million, one of the largest corporate losses ever recorded at the time. The message was unmistakable. Consumer safety would come before every financial measure. Carrying out the recall was not simple. It required coordination between hospitals, distributors, local pharmacies, and major retailers. Truckloads of Tylenol were removed in hurried sweeps. Managers in supermarkets sealed off aisles, not only in Illinois but in states far from Chicago. Pharmacies gathered the bottles in back rooms until company representatives could collect them. In some cases, police literally escorted shipments out of stores to be destroyed, so there was no chance of them slipping back into circulation. For employees on the front lines, the situation looked like the largest product cleanout they had ever experienced. At the same time, boxes and bags filled with Tylenol bottles began arriving at police stations. Families came in, holding bottles with visible worry, asking authorities to examine them. Many wanted to be told whether their capsules were dangerous, but officers had no way to test each one on the spot. Still, the act of turning bottles over showed how deeply the recall reached. It was no longer only about what pharmacies carried. People pulled half-empty containers from their kitchen drawers, their purses, and their medicine chests, bringing them into authorities as if they were turning in live weapons. Media coverage magnified every angle. Television broadcasts cut between grieving families, customers handing in bottles, and images of shelves stripped clean. Newspapers tallied the financial cost and published front-page notices urging people to destroy any Tylenol they had in their homes. The visibility of the recall turned it into not just a corporate choice but a national demonstration. The world could see that Johnson & Johnson had taken the largest action possible, and while the cost was immense, the move did not end the corporation. Instead, it began to rebuild trust that had been nearly destroyed. Part of what helped the company was that there was very little denial or deflection. Rather than arguing about their innocence or trying to blame outside factors, Johnson & Johnson acknowledged the risk and absorbed the damage directly. The decision to recall every bottle sent a clear message. No matter how expensive, no measure mattered more than protecting consumers. That approach shifted public perception. While fear still remained, Ordinary citizens noticed that the company acted faster and more massively than anyone had expected. The recall also carried lessons far beyond one product. It showed the nation what corporate crisis management could look like under public pressure. At the time, very few companies had faced such visible danger tied directly to their leading product. Many observers thought the Tylenol brand would collapse completely, never again trusted by the public. Yet within a year, Johnson & Johnson was able to regain significant market share. They managed to do this partly because of the trust gained in how they managed the situation. By taking the hit publicly, they turned what could have been total ruin into a process of recovery. Of course, regaining that trust also meant changing the way the product was sold. Capsules were redesigned, and tamper-evident packaging soon appeared as a standard across consumer medicine. But those reforms came later. In the early days after the murders, the recall stood as the single most visible response. Executives knew every day's delay translated into more hysteria, more phone calls to hospitals, more findings of suspect bottles in random locations. The quick pull from store shelves demonstrated urgency, something the public desperately needed as fear spread. On the ground, the process of pulling bottles from stores unfolded in dramatic fashion. Truck drivers collected boxes in bulk, sometimes loading entire shipments that had yet to reach retail floors. Police escorted some deliveries out of stores with caution tape wrapped around boxes as if they were evidence logs. The image of an everyday pain medicine being handled like toxic material underscored the seriousness of the moment. And for Johnson & Johnson, it showed the scale of coordination required between private corporations and government agencies to respond to a crisis that touched millions of lives at once. In Chicago, the recall added to the bizarre scene already unfolding. Police precincts here looked not only like places solving murders, but like storage centers for cartons of medicine, bottles stacked up on tables, and evidence counters waiting for unsafe destruction. Residents, driving up to stations, displayed both fear and relief as they handed them over. Some people admitted they had not even opened the bottle, but they did not want to risk it. The act of surrender became part of the city's grieving process, a visible way for citizens to protect themselves against an unseen threat. By pulling 31 million bottles and absorbing a cost of over $100 million, Johnson & Johnson created a blueprint for corporate responsibility under extraordinary conditions. Business schools would later cite the recall as a model in crisis response. The strategy did not erase the deaths or end the investigation, but it softened the collapse of trust around the brand. People eventually began to buy Tylenol again, not because they had forgotten, but because they saw how aggressively the company had handled the crisis. Even so, while the business side of the tragedy presented a path forward, the law enforcement side remained as murky as ever. Bottles had been taken away, sales stopped, but no one knew who had done the tampering, how many capsules they had poisoned, or whether they would strike again. The company may have regained some measure of public trust, but the killer behind the poisoned capsules was still at large, still faceless, and still a threat. And that reality meant the pressure on investigators did not ease. Even after the last bottles disappeared from store shelves, the poisoned capsules were not from a single factory line, so where were they tampered with? That was the central question investigators faced once Tylenol was confirmed as the link between the 7 Chicago deaths. The Food and Drug Administration and law enforcement immediately tracked the supply chain, expecting a problem at one of Johnson & Johnson's facilities. The assumption seemed logical. If poison had been introduced into the medicine, the most likely place would be during production or packaging at the plant level. But when investigators traced the victims' bottles, something surprising came up. The contaminated bottles did not originate from one factory. They had been distributed from 2 separate plants, each in different states. That detail shifted the focus instantly. A manufacturing error could be ruled out almost immediately. Whatever had happened took place after the Tylenol left the factory floor. This finding created both relief and new anxiety. Relief, because it meant the company's manufacturing process had not been compromised. Anxiety, because the tampering now had to have happened at random points much closer to the consumer. That made the problem unpredictable. Bottles could have been poisoned anywhere along the retail chain. It could have happened inside warehouses, delivery trucks, or on store shelves themselves. The randomness pulled investigators away from a centralized explanation and forced them to consider an unsettling new possibility. Someone moved openly in public spaces, altering bottles and returning them without being spotted. The theory that gained traction was chilling in its simplicity. A person could walk into a pharmacy, buy a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, take it home, open the capsules, and replace the medicine with potassium cyanide. Once that was done, they could carefully close the capsules again, return them to the bottle, and deliver the bottle back to the shelf. In the early 1980s, returns were not heavily monitored. A bottle could be carried back or simply placed among the others without raising suspicion. With no foil, seal, or shrink-wrapped lid, the packaging looked untouched once it was placed back on display. Shoppers, who later picked up that same bottle, would have no way of knowing it had been handled. Evidence soon supported this idea. After the deaths had already shaken the city, additional tainted bottles were discovered sitting in Chicago area stores. These were not bottles from the homes of victims, but unopened containers still available for sale. In other words, the killer had not stopped at targeting one or two bottles that reached certain families. Poisoned capsules were scattered across different locations, waiting for whoever happened to pick them up that day. This made the situation even more dangerous, because it proved the contamination was not contained to a single household or one unlucky string of purchases. Anyone grabbing Tylenol from a shelf in Chicago risked buying medicine already seeded with death. Understanding the packaging of that era is key to why this was possible. In today's market, every bottle of pain medicine is sealed in layers. There is usually a plastic neck wrap, a foil or paper interior seal, and often a childproof cap that clicks into place. But in 1982, those protections largely did not exist. A customer only had to unscrew the cap, and the medicine was accessible. Capsules, unlike pressed tablets, were particularly easy to manipulate. Each capsule was made of two halves that fit snugly together, but could simply be twisted apart. There were no visual clues when they were put back together. Capsules were convenient for swallowing, but vulnerable to anyone determined to tamper. This lack of security turned routine consumer behavior into the perfect cover for a killer. No specialized tools or insider access were required. A man or woman could blend in with shoppers, tamper with bottles in private, and return them to retail spaces without attracting notice. This is what made catching the perpetrator so difficult. There was no centralized point of contamination, like a mixing tank at a factory or a single distributor's warehouse to investigate. Instead, investigators faced the possibility of dozens of random locations, each one vulnerable to interference, scattered across a sprawling metropolitan area. The randomness of the locations reinforced the strategy behind the poisonings. By placing bottles in different suburbs and stores, the killer created a sense of chaos. Families who never met one another, who lived in entirely separate communities, all suffered losses from the same product. An employee in one town, a homemaker in another, a child in a separate suburb. There was no pattern to track geographically, nothing to tie investigators to a single place or suspect. The randomness ensured that no one could predict where the next poisoning might occur. Fear multiplied, because danger seemed to lurk everywhere rather than in one contained area. Police sifted through store records, trying to track how each bottle arrived on each shelf. But this quickly proved to be an impossible task. Deliveries came from distribution centers that handled countless products every week. Once bottles left trucks and entered stockrooms, employees rotated them onto shelves without detailed notes. The system simply was not designed to monitor product histories like that. The lack of tamper-proof packaging meant there was also no way to determine whether a purchased bottle had been opened before. A closed cap did not mean a safe bottle. It only meant it looked the same as other ordinary bottles stacked beside it. For investigators, the scope of the problem was daunting. They could not stake out every pharmacy or grocery store in Chicago. They could not question every shopper who bought Tylenol in the weeks leading up to the deaths. The anonymity of the act gave the killer their power. Whoever tampered with the Tylenol had selected the most common, most trusted product and used the most public, least traceable route to weaponize it. This use of public shelves as both a hiding place and a release point guaranteed that suspicion spread across the entire city, while evidence of the killer's identity remained invisible. The scattered nature of the poisoned bottles meant investigators could only gather clues after the fact. Grieving families turned over half-used bottles. Store clerks handed police containers, still sealed inside boxes, but later revealed to hold cyanide. Each new discovery confirmed the method, but none of them explained who was behind it. The randomness of the placement gave no discernible fingerprint. It seemed designed to obscure rather than reveal. As a result, frustration grew within law enforcement. They had uncovered how the capsules were poisoned, but not who had done it, nor how many bottles remained undiscovered. In the aftermath, safety experts pointed to the lack of protection in packaging as the critical weakness. Without barriers, the killer had weaponized the openness of consumer products, and by targeting random sites across a large metropolitan region, they erased the trail investigators might otherwise follow. The conclusion was clear and unsettling. The killer's weapon was not just cyanide, but also the anonymity provided by public shelves. This realization made the murders even more frightening in their scope. It showed that any ordinary consumer could unknowingly participate in the distribution by buying, handling, or discarding a bottle. The randomness of the act meant there was no way to narrow the field down to one suspect profile. It was chaos by design. That is why the case shifted once again. Having understood the mechanics of how the capsules reached consumers, investigators turned their attention toward possible individuals who might have motive or access to cyanide, hoping that behind the randomness there might still be a pattern pointing to one person. Names emerged, but none fit perfectly. In the days after the Tylenol murders, the public wanted clarity. Investigators were under enormous pressure to show progress and to point to a suspect who could explain the chaos. Tips poured in from across Chicago and beyond. Some were obvious false leads, others more promising. Among the most notable suspects, none captured as much attention as James William Lewis. Lewis entered the case not because of physical evidence linking him to the poisoned bottles, but because of a letter that arrived shortly after the deaths. The letter demanded $1 million from Johnson & Johnson and claimed responsibility for the poisonings. Written in clear language, the letter was addressed directly to the head of the company and described how Tylenol capsules had been contaminated. On its surface, this seemed like the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. Someone had finally stepped forward, claiming direct involvement, but as authorities examined the letter more closely, problems surfaced. The postmark date did not align with the timeline of the poisonings. It appeared Lewis had mailed the letter after news of the deaths had already gone public. This suggested to investigators that he may not have been the original perpetrator, but rather someone seeing an opportunity to extort the company. Forensic analysis of the letter provided little else. The details inside could have been pulled from media reporting. There were no specifics unique enough to prove insider knowledge of how the capsules were tampered with. Still, investigators could not ignore the letter. They moved quickly to locate Lewis, who was already known to authorities for other financial issues. His background included fraud and a pattern of questionable schemes. When confronted, Lewis denied being the Tylenol killer, but admitted to sending the letter. He described it as a way to take advantage of the company during a national crisis, not as a confession to murder. Police charged him, but not with homicide. Instead, he was convicted of extortion and sentenced to prison. For the families of the victims, this was a frustrating outcome. The man who placed himself in the middle of the investigation by writing the ransom note was not charged with the deaths. Officially, he remained only a criminal opportunist. The focus then turned to Roger Arnold, another man who came under suspicion. Arnold was a grocery store employee in Chicago, with potential access to cyanide through his job. Rumors began to spread that he had knowledge of chemistry and the ability to acquire the compound used in the poisonings. Police investigated and noted that his behavior during questioning raised concern. His physical proximity to the distribution of consumer goods and his supposed familiarity with cyanide seemed enough to push him onto the suspect list. The media became heavily involved at this stage. Newspapers and broadcast outlets, desperate for new developments, printed Arnold's name and position widely. Neighbors began to whisper. Strangers pointed. Soon, Roger Arnold's identity was tied publicly to the Tylenol murders, even without direct evidence. This made daily life unbearable for him. He eventually underwent such levels of scrutiny that he was forced into isolation. The story grew worse when, after being wrongly associated with the case, Arnold became the target of hostility. One man, misled by the rumors, confronted Arnold in a bar. In a tragic turn, that encounter ended in violence. Arnold, already devastated by suspicion and media coverage, became a pariah. Later, the police admitted there was insufficient proof. Roger Arnold was never charged with the poisonings. Over the following years, science became central to efforts to eliminate suspects. DNA testing advanced significantly by the late 1990s and early 2000s. Samples from both Lewis and Arnold were compared against evidence collected from the crime scene and packaging. Each time, the results removed them further from the possibility of being guilty. Neither man could be linked by physical evidence to the cyanide or the poisoned bottles. What had once been promising, leads collapsed into dead ends upon closer inspection. Authorities also cast their net wider. The sheer skill and randomness of the Tylenol murders led some to believe the crime could align with other high-profile criminals. At one point, the FBI reached out for the DNA of Ted Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber. His attacks throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s showed an appetite for bringing chaos through ordinary consumer channels. Investigators considered whether his philosophy of targeting modern technology and society could overlap with tampering with mainstream medicine. Yet the checks revealed no proven connection, and the possibility faded. The request showed how desperate investigators were to match the Tylenol killings to someone capable, but no figure ever fully fit. As the decades went on, it became clear that the Tylenol murders would continue without a definitive suspect. This lack of closure sets the case apart from many other crimes of its era. High-profile murders often end with an arrest, even if guilt remains debated. In this case, no such conclusion came. The public had to settle with unsatisfying partial answers. They saw Lewis punished for extortion, though it never connected him concretely to poisoning. They watched Arnold suffer from wrongful suspicion, only to walk away cleared but permanently scarred by his public exposure. They read speculation about Kaczynski, but saw that trail vanish as quickly as it appeared. This cycle wore down the families of victims. Each new announcement about DNA testing or suspected links created a spike of attention, only to fade again when nothing solid was proven. Relatives of the 7 victims were left to navigate decades of uncertainty, watching their personal loss move in and out of headlines without reaching conclusion. Questions remained about motive, about logistics, about identity. The sheer lack of clarity around who could or would commit such a crime reinforced the idea that the poisonings had been engineered for maximum chaos rather than personal gain. Despite significant suspects, the investigation never crossed the line into definitive guilt for any one person. The ransom letter writer turned out to be a fraudster, not a murderer. The grocery store worker bore the weight of false accusations, but carried no real connection to the poisonings. Even a notorious domestic terrorist like Kaczynski failed to align with the evidence on hand. The case of the Tylenol murders simply refused to provide a clear suspect narrative. Investigators eventually had to admit that while the crime revealed vulnerability in consumer products, it did not reveal the identity of its perpetrator. Every trail, no matter how public or promising, ended in dismissal or unrelated conviction. The poisoner's shadow loomed large, but the person behind it never emerged. No fingerprints, no unique chemical signatures, no credible confession. The work of decades left police with theories, but never an arrest they could sustain in court. This absence of resolution turned the Tylenol murders into one of the great unsolved crimes in American history. Unlike other mass killings or serial poisonings, which have known culprits to explain their horror, this case offers none. All that remains are the names of people who might have had motive or opportunity, but who ultimately proved unconnected. Even decades later, the police files tell the same story. 7 people dead, dozens of tainted bottles recovered, and no one to hold responsible. The weight of uncertainty has outlived all the early suspects, marking the case with an unfinished quality that continues to haunt American crime history. The killings stopped, but the fear never truly left. In the months after Chicago's nightmare, the city tried to calm down, but the damage to trust in everyday products had already been done. What people once saw as safe medicine became a symbol of vulnerability. Even after the last tainted bottles were collected and destroyed, unease lingered in homes across America. The crime had revealed a flaw no one had considered before, that the products people bought and trusted could be turned into weapons without warning. As the 1980s progressed, the shadow of Tylenol reappeared in different parts of the country. Tampering cases spread across states, some real, others hoaxes meant to frighten. There were reports of contaminated sodas, altered candy, and misleading claims about tainted medicine. Not all were genuine, but even false cases exploited the fear that had taken hold in Chicago. If it could happen once, it could happen again. Each report, however minor, carried a kernel of possibility. The idea of random tampering had entered public awareness, and it no longer seemed unimaginable. Communities faced a new form of anxiety. It was no longer about a specific suspect. It was about the products they placed in shopping carts and cupboards. Parents hesitated before giving children medicine or candy. Store clerks fielded constant questions about safety. Newspapers ran stories about copycat attempts, and even when cases turned out to be hoaxes, the message was clear. Anyone could tamper with a product, and consumers had no simple defense. Suspicion spread outward from Chicago, changing how families approached everyday purchases. Regulatory agencies could not ignore the shift. Officials examined consumer safety from the ground up and realized there were no clear protections against this kind of crime. The federal government, the Food and Drug Administration, and Congress began devising ways to restore public confidence. It was no longer enough to tell people to avoid certain bottles. Laws and packaging had to change to make tampering visible and punishable. The most obvious reforms came in packaging. After 1982, tamper-evident designs became standard for over-the-counter medicine. Bottles that were once easy to open now featured layers of protection. Consumers began peeling foil seals, breaking plastic wraps on caps, and twisting childproof lids that clicked or locked. Blister packs, sealing capsules and tablets individually in plastic and foil, became common. These measures slowed tampering and made it nearly impossible to hide. The days of lightweight capsules inside simple bottles were numbered, as the industry recognized how easily they could be manipulated. Lawmakers pushed for accountability as well. Congress passed what became known as the Tylenol Bill, making product tampering a federal offense. Before that, prosecutions relied on state laws, which varied and were often inadequate for this type of crime. Elevating tampering to the federal level allowed investigators to cross state lines and use national resources to pursue anyone attempting to poison consumer goods. The law sent a clear signal. Product tampering was not mischief or local criminal damage. It was a violent threat to the public. Johnson & Johnson's response became just as influential as the law itself. The company's leadership had chosen to recall all Tylenol bottles, losing over $100 million, prioritizing consumer safety above the survival of their most profitable brand. That decision set a new standard for corporate crisis management. Communication was also critical. Rather than deflect blame, Johnson & Johnson spoke openly about risks and moved quickly to redesign packaging. Business schools later used the case as a textbook example of how a company could recover after a crisis. The ripple effects reached industries far beyond medicine. Candy sales, long tied to trust in Halloween rituals, dropped as families grew cautious. Parents inspected treats carefully, cutting open candy bars or discarding anything not factory sealed. The culture of consumer behavior shifted. Where people once handled bottles and boxes without thought, they now checked seals and wrappers. What had seemed unnecessary became routine, turning caps to see if the seal cracked, peeling foil tops before trusting medicine. This culture of caution extended beyond medicine and candy. Supermarkets saw shoppers checking labels more carefully. Food producers adapted with stronger seals on jars and plastic coverings on drinks. Safety became visible, not assumed. Packages without seals or protective designs began to look suspicious. The Tylenol murders permanently altered what everyday families accepted as normal safety practice. These new rules and safeguards did more than ease fear. They rebuilt trust. Consumers gradually returned to store aisles, relying on tamper-evident packaging to signal safety. But decades later, trust was never as blind as before. Every torn seal, every cracked plastic wrap, served as a reminder of the cost of absence. The Tylenol murders also cemented the role of coordinated responses between law enforcement and health officials. The case blurred the line between criminal investigation and public health, influencing how future outbreaks and contamination events were handled. Whether in food, medicine, or consumer items, officials now had a blueprint for collaboration. Copycat tampering cases continued to appear, though few matched the scale of the original tragedy. Each was met with swift response and stronger legal consequences. Laws and packaging gave Americans a way to guard against such acts. Safety could never be guaranteed completely, but the invisibility the original killer had relied on was removed. Every safety seal torn open today points back to the Tylenol murders. The shift was permanent. No company could ignore tamper-evident protection, and no consumer would accept less. Ordinary life had been rewritten. Trust in packaged goods was no longer automatic. It had to be earned. Decades later, the fact that the killer was never found means those seals remain not only practical, they are enduring reminders of how one unsolved crime reshaped consumer safety worldwide. Nearly 4 decades later, the Tylenol murders remain unfinished business in America's crime history. 7 people died, poisoned by a product they trusted, and yet no one has ever been charged with their murders. It is not that the case was ignored. On the contrary, it has been reopened many times. Each new wave of investigation has carried hope that science or persistence would finally deliver answers. Families waited for news, journalists revisited the tragedy, and investigators tried again with tools that barely existed in 1982. But every attempt has led back to the same place, an empty space where the name of the killer should be. The first big developments came in the years after DNA testing became a common forensic tool. Detectives returned to evidence stored carefully since the early 1980s. They hoped modern testing would produce a clear connection to one of the men long suspected, or perhaps someone new altogether. Bottles, capsules, and letters were all re-examined. Specialists worked with fragments of material, looking for strands of DNA that might have been left behind. The thought was that tampering with capsules should have left some trace. Sweat, skin cells, even a fingerprint in chemical residue. Yet, when the results returned, they eliminated suspects rather than confirming them. The men whose names had lingered longest in the public record were crossed off instead of being confirmed. Later reviews took place as technology advanced further. Cold case teams in the 2000s and 2010s tried again. Reports surfaced that law enforcement had tested evidence against national DNA databases, hoping to find a match among convicted offenders. Dozens of other cases had been solved this way. Families of the Tylenol victims held their breath as each round played out. Still, none of the evidence linked to anyone on record. Each time the silence felt sharper, because every failed attempt confirmed how little the killer had left behind. Unlike many crime scenes where tools, weapons, or personal connections might betray the person responsible, this one had only ordinary medicine as its stage. The lack of motive made the case even harder to close. Randomness has always defined the Tylenol murders. There was no pattern in the victims' lives that tied them to each other. A child, a young postal worker, a homemaker, siblings. They had no shared circle. No reason an outsider might target them directly. The randomness suggested that the killer was not seeking money, revenge, or even recognition. That made the crime both chilling and unique. To place cyanide into capsules and scatter them across stores was not just murder, it was a strike against public trust itself. The aim seemed to be fear, and unlike crimes where jealousy, anger, or greed can be traced, fear left nothing that investigators could track. For the families of the 7 victims, the absence of answers has been a constant part of their grief. Parents and siblings watched as each investigation promised progress, only to lose momentum again. During anniversaries, the case reappeared in headlines. Statements from officials often mentioned renewed hope, especially whenever new DNA techniques were unveiled. But hope without resolution became its own burden. Decades later, the families have been left without the closure that many victims of violent crime eventually receive through trials or convictions. Instead, they live with the knowledge that the person who caused their loss has never been held accountable. The Tylenol murders also blurred boundaries between law enforcement and public health. Detectives worked side by side with health officials, pharmacists, and doctors to address the danger in real time. Hospitals received instructions not just to treat symptoms, but to report patterns immediately. Pharmacies carried out urgent recalls in coordination with police. The case became a hybrid, part homicide investigation, part emergency health response. That model continues to influence how future product scares are managed. Contamination cases, outbreaks of tainted food, and other consumer crises often borrow from the structure built during those frantic weeks in 1982. It was one of the first times a murder investigation spilled directly into the daily lives of millions of healthy people who had no idea they were potential victims. Through all of this, the unanswered question has remained the same. Who tampered with the Tylenol bottles, replacing simple medicine with a lethal poison? Was it someone seeking chaos for its own sake? Was it someone with a grievance never uncovered? Or was it a person who believed they could hide inside the flow of ordinary shoppers and disappear without a trace? No firm evidence has ever indicated which explanation is true. The ransom note, the suspects who looked promising, the DNA samples, all of it together still points to nothing certain. The most haunting part is that the killer may have watched it all unfold, unseen and unidentified, as the city panicked and families mourned. Decades later, law enforcement has not closed the door completely. The FBI has reviewed the case more than once, and cold case investigators in Illinois have opened files hoping that one detail overlooked years ago might hold the key. Advances in forensics keep the possibility alive, but each passing year makes it less likely. If the killer acted alone and left no confession, fingerprints, or reliable witnesses, there may simply be nothing left to find. In that sense, the Tylenol murders stand as a crime perfected by its simplicity. Nothing mechanical, no elaborate scheme, just poisoned capsules placed among the ordinary. That anonymity is what allowed it to last unsolved. The effect has been long and heavy. Some crimes shape daily behavior for a season and then fade. This one reshaped entire industries and secured new laws, yet it ended without a known culprit. Victims' names remain, safety seals on medicine bottles remain, but the space where the killer's name should stand is still blank. It is rare for any crime to produce such vast change in public life, while denying all closure about who committed it. That is part of why the Tylenol murders continue to be studied and remembered long after 1982. Some mysteries stay alive because they hint at hidden chapters. Here, it is the silence that holds power. The killer who turned trust into fear still walks without recognition, either gone with time or living quietly beyond suspicion. Nearly 40 years later, that fact has outlived the chaos of the recall, the headlines of grief, and the panic in Chicago homes. It is the enduring reminder that some crimes rewrite the way society works even when their authors are never unmasked. And in that silence lies the most unsettling truth of all, that the person who once swapped capsules inside bottles found on store shelves left behind a shadow that still lingers in every seal we break today. The Tylenol murders were never solved, yet their impact changed consumer safety forever. Safety seals, blister packs, and tamper-evident packaging became standard not because of innovation, but because of fear. Every time you twist a cap and hear the crack of plastic, you're seeing the legacy of this case. But here's the question: what ordinary item in your home do you trust without thinking twice? A bottle? A snack? A drink? The truth is, trust is invisible until it's broken. And maybe the most unsettling part of the Tylenol murders is this: the killer was never caught.